Athens, the most famous Greek city, a small community in the south of the country that left an enormous footprint on history. The birthplace of philosophers like Socrates and Plato, and of playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides and Aristophanes, trailblazers who effectively invented theatre as we know it today. And most famously of all, the place where democracy was born. The first state in history to give power of its governance over to its people. A place where every citizen could vote, and no one person's vote counted for any more or any less than anyone else's. The first truly democratic system. Sort of. Kinda. Maybe. That we know of. I mean, I for one doubt that in the many thousands of years of human history, nobody before the classical Athenians thought to make decisions through voting or through popular consensus. That seems like a little bit of a stretch. Not to mention, by modern standards, ancient Athenian democracy was not all that democratic or representative. To start with, women could not vote or stand for office in any capacity at all. So that's 50% of the population already excluded. Doesn't sound very democratic to us 21st century people. And even amongst men, getting involved in the democracy was not a right that everybody had. To participate, you needed legal citizenship, and that was not universal. Also, we must never forget the not inconsiderable portion of the population that were enslaved. Obviously, they didn't get to participate either. You could argue that our modern idea of democracy is inspired by the ancient Athenian one, like our word democracy comes from the Greek demokratia, the power of the people. But it's a bit of a stretch to say that modern democracies are really inspired by the ancient Athenians. Modern democracies tend to function very differently to that of 5th century Athens, and are usually more overtly inspired by the Roman Republic than they are by Athens. But all of that nuance is for a different conversation in a different video. For simplicity's sake, let's just say that democracy was born in the city of Theseus. But it was not always so. Athens was not always the shining example of Greek culture that it would eventually become. Nor was it always a democracy. If we rewind the historical clock all the way back to 600 BCE, Athens didn't look anything like the kind of city that would one day be admired for its state building. In the same year that the vultures were picking at the corpse of the once great Assyrian Empire, at the same time as Croesus of Lydia was expanding his kingdom and inventing coinage, and whilst Necho II of Egypt was sending expeditions around the continent of Africa, the city of Athens was in chaos. Political divisions and social strife were tearing this small Greek city apart. At this time, Athens was governed as an oligarchy, a small group of powerful, wealthy and aristocratic families held total dominance over the politics of the city. Officially speaking, the city was governed by 9 archons. Back in Athens' early history, the archonship was a magistracy, a position that was held for life. At some point, as the years went on, this was restricted to a 10-year term of office, and by the year 600 BCE, archons served for only a single year. Once an archon's term of office was up, once their year was over, they would leave and join the Council of Areopagus, which was the highest law court in the land. So the aristocracy of Athens governed their city through these 2 institutions: the archonship, the 9 officials that governed it day to day, and the Council of Areopagus, the law court. But they did not govern wisely. Athenian politics was characterized by infighting between the aristocratic families. Petty jealousies and ancient feuds often got in the way of good governance. And of course, the real victims here were the regular Athenian people, who weren't part of the aristocracy and couldn't give a damn about their infighting. It was the regular people that were exploited and abused by the nobility in their endless bickering with each other. By the year 600 BCE, the Athenian aristocracy had bought up, had purchased basically all of the land in Attica. Attica is the region that surrounds Athens. And the regular people were forced to work this land for a ruinous rent of 1/6 of everything that they produced. This made the poor even poorer, and it made the rich even richer, and when the poor inevitably fell into debt or bankruptcy and couldn't pay their rents anymore, they were forced to sell themselves or their families into slavery. This situation was becoming utterly intolerable. Our sources don't go into too much detail about exactly how, but the implication is that violence had either already broken out or was about to break out any minute. The poor were making demands for justice and a more equal society, and the rich didn't want to give in to any of these demands and lose out on their massive profits. To solve this upcoming political crisis, a mediator was chosen. The Athenians turned to a man called Solon, who's a fascinating recurring character from Greek history, known for his sage wisdom and his honesty. Solon was a patriotic Athenian who had openly expressed his pain at seeing his homeland torn apart by internal strife and division. Solon was also of noble birth and came from a fairly wealthy family, but he wasn't from the top echelon of Athenian aristocracy that so many people blamed for the country's woes. Because of this, he was the kind of guy that both sides felt they could deal with, both sides felt they could work with, and he was trusted to make honest and good decisions without showing too much favouritism. Solon would not found Athenian democracy, but he would lay the groundwork for it later. The first reform he did was a huge one. He forgave all of the debts owed by the poor to the rich, and he forbade the practice of selling those who had run out of money into slavery. This was a big moment in Athenian history, the moment that the abusive power of the landlords was smashed once and for all. Even 200 years later, in Aristotle's day, this moment was still remembered by the Athenians as being very significant in their history as a people. They call it the shaking off of the burdens. Solon also founded a new council to help rule over the city, the Boule, or the Council of 400. Attica, the territory of Athens, was traditionally divided into 4 tribes, and each of these tribes would now have the opportunity to send 100 men to the council to represent them and their interests. The idea here seems to have been to provide a counterweight to the aristocratic Council of Areopagus, the High Court, and help break the aristocracy's total monopoly over the governance of Athens. Plutarch, a Greek biographer who wrote around 7 centuries after Solon lived, said that he did this for the same reason that some ships have 2 anchors, one on each side, each providing a counterweight to the other one, keeping the ship in place, steady, making sure it didn't sway too far in either direction. So that is how Solon helped uplift the poor and the downtrodden of Athens. He cancelled the ruinous debts. He ended the barbaric practice of Athenians selling their own people into slavery when they couldn't pay them. And he broke the monopoly on power that the aristocracy held over the city. But Solon was not a radical reformer, neither was he a revolutionary. He didn't intend to destroy the aristocracy, he merely wished to limit its abuses. The most powerful offices of state were still reserved only for the very, very wealthy. You know, the same people who still owned basically all of the land in Attica. As you can imagine, these reforms pleased basically nobody. The poor wanted land redistribution, and they wanted more radical action to be taken against the abuses of the nobles. And those nobles had hoped that Solon, who was technically one of them, would simply placate the masses with some small symbolic changes, whilst basically letting them keep all of their power. But Solon had done neither of these things. He had hurt the rich, but he had failed to truly uplift the poor. He was the ultimate centrist, carving a path directly down the middle between the 2 political extremes, and by doing so, pleasing nobody and merely kicking the can of more radical reform further down the road. But none of that mattered to Solon. He had adventures to go on, he had poetry to write, and he had wisdom to impart. He made the Athenians swear an oath to uphold his laws, and then he left on a world tour. And that was that for him. That's the end of him in our story. He went to Egypt for a little while, a place that the Greeks always loved to go to on holiday, before eventually landing up in the court of King Croesus of Lydia, where he gave the king some sage advice on the nature of fortune. Back in Athens, Solon's reforms had utterly failed to bring an end to the political and social discontent in the city. In the years 590 and 586, things had gotten so bad that, for some reason, the city failed to even appoint any magistrates, and these years are remembered as the Anarchy, the years without archons, which is where our word anarchy comes from. In the year 582, one of the archons simply refused to give up his seat once his term of office was up. He stayed in power for another whole year before he was eventually removed by his rivals. This was chaos, it was a disaster, and aristocratic infighting seems to have been the culprit. Different noble families, all with long-standing resentments against one another, vying for power in this city of Athens. One of these aristocrats, a man called Pisistratus, eventually rose above the others to seize power. Pisistratus ruled Athens like a king. The Greek word for this is tyrant or tyrannos. Now, tyrant is a fairly loaded word in English. It has a lot of negative connotations attached to it. But to the Greeks, it had a subtly different meaning. A tyrant wasn't necessarily a bad ruler. He was a ruler who seized power unconstitutionally. Someone who had no right to rule, but did so anyway. It was possible in ancient Greece to be a good tyrant. And if our sources are to be believed, Pisistratus was kind of a good tyrant. He respected the law, he was generous with money, he didn't meddle too much in people's private affairs. He ruled more like a citizen than a tyrant. That being said, not everybody was happy with this new arrangement. Pisistratus had made many enemies on his road to power, particularly amongst the aristocracy, and now that he was in total control of Athens, these enemies of his found themselves driven into exile. And even amongst the aristocrats that weren't overt enemies of Pisistratus, they found that their ambitions were being stifled by the tyranny. These noble families were used to infighting with each other. They were used to getting one over on each other and climbing the ladder of power. But now with Pisistratus in total command of everything, there was only so high that they could rise. One such man was Miltiades, son of Cypselus. Miltiades was from an ancient clan of noble lineage called the Phileids, who could trace their family all the way back to Phyleus, son of Ajax, a hero of the Trojan War. Miltiades was, in many ways, thriving under the rule of Pisistratus. You know, he was a famed Olympic victor. He had lots of wealth and power, and Herodotus says that he was a man of influence. But, like many aristocrats at the time, he was an ambitious guy who wanted more, and found himself chafing under the dominance of the tyranny. So, when a group of heavily armed Thracians appeared at Miltiades' door one day, and offered him rule over the Chersonese if he would only go north with them and help them defeat a neighbouring tribe, he accepted. Miltiades packed up all of his belongings, left Athens, and sailed north to carve out a kingdom for himself in the north of the country. Remember this, by the way. The Phileids and their little domain in the north of Greece will come up again later in the video. Pisistratus died in the year 527 BCE, and when he did so, he left rule of Athens to his eldest son, a guy called Hippias, who ruled with the aid of his younger brother, Hipparchus. Hippias, initially at least, showed all the signs of being a capable ruler, just like his father was, whilst Hipparchus, the younger brother, was a little bit more childish and a little bit more brutal. The incident that would undo this Pisistratid tyranny began with this troublesome second son, Hipparchus. He fell completely head over heels in love with a young man called Harmodius, and he tried time and time again to seduce Harmodius. But this guy wasn't having any of it. Harmodius was not interested in Hipparchus. He already had a lover he was already spoken for. He was in love with another man called Aristogeiton. Hipparchus did not take this well at all. He started harassing Harmodius, becoming increasingly unpleasant and increasingly threatening with each failed attempt to seduce him. Eventually, Hipparchus started victimizing Harmodius's family members, either out of revenge for being rejected, or maybe to try and guilt-trip Harmodius into leaving Aristogeiton for him. Seeing no way out of this, Harmodius and Aristogeiton began to plot. And one day, during the great Panathenaea festival, the couple struck. In the middle of the city, before hundreds of onlookers, Harmodius and Aristogeiton rushed Hipparchus with daggers in their hands, and they cut him down on the spot. The two lovers then attempted to escape into the crowd, but they weren't quick enough. Harmodius was killed by the tyrant's bodyguards, and Aristogeiton was taken alive. Aristogeiton was hauled before Hippias, the brother of the man he had just murdered, and then he was subjected to days of horrific torture. And during these days, Aristogeiton named names. Hundreds of names. Before long, he was painting a picture like the entire city of Athens was part of this great conspiracy to take the brothers down. Even 200 years later, in Aristotle's day, the Athenians still debated how much of this list of plotters was genuine. Aristotle gives us three theories as to the validity of the list of names given by Aristogeiton. The first theory is that none of these names were genuine. Instead, Aristogeiton, crafty and cunning as he was, named people who he knew Hippias was friends with. He was hoping he could turn the tyrant paranoid, get him to turn against his own allies, and by doing so, he would weaken his position. The second theory, which is endorsed by the 5th century Athenian writer Thucydides, is that all of the names on the list were genuine, and that there actually was a massive citywide conspiracy that aimed at taking down the whole tyranny and killing both brothers. But when the day that they planned to strike actually came around, most of the plotters chickened out last minute, and only Harmodius and Aristogeiton actually followed through on their part of the plan to kill Hipparchus. And the third theory that Aristotle hints at is that Aristogeiton had been tortured for days. He was delirious with pain, and he was saying anything he could think of that might get his jailers to finally put him out of his misery and kill him. But Hippias, turned cruel by his brother's murder and paranoid by the long list of names he had been given, wouldn't let Aristogeiton die. Eventually, the tortured man devised a way to end his ordeal. He tells Hippias that he will give him a final list of names, and that the tyrant should take him by the right hand, so that he might make a pledge to tell him the truth. Hippias takes his hand, at which point Aristogeiton laughed at him, and reviled Hippias for having grasped the hand of his brother's murderer. This sent the tyrant into a black rage. He grabbed a dagger and killed Aristogeiton on the spot. Still angry and still scared, Hippias turned on his own people. He began putting people to death left, right, and centre. Hippias was determined to hold on to power and to preserve his own life, and to this end, he ruled over Athens with an iron fist, his paranoia manifesting itself in the form of a reign of terror. After all, if his own people feared him, who would dare ever oppose him? But Hippias did not account for moves being made by people abroad. I mentioned earlier that when Pisistratus first took power, a good many noble families in Athens departed the city. Some of them were enemies of Pisistratus who had been driven into exile, but others, like Miltiades the Phaleid, felt restricted by the tyranny and left of their own accord. One such family was a clan called the Alcmaeonids. The Alcmaeonids were an interesting bunch. Pay attention to them. They've got a fair few major roles to play in Greek history, and we're going to be hearing plenty about them in future videos, I have no doubt. But their story begins long before Pisistratus and long before Solon. To tell the story of the Alcmaeonids, we have to rewind 120 years before Harmodius and Aristogeiton killed Hipparchus, to the year 636 BCE. It was in this year that a powerful aristocrat and Olympic victor called Cylon attempted to seize power in Athens. Just as Pisistratus would do a few decades later, he hoped to take power in the city and then rule over it as a tyrant. But unlike Pisistratus, he utterly failed to do this. Cylon vastly overestimated his own popularity and his own influence, and his coup was just a complete fiasco. Cylon watched as his plan to take Athens for himself fell apart around him, and he watched as the city turned on him and his supporters. Seeing it all go wrong, they decided to flee to the Acropolis and tie themselves to a statue of Athena. This was a clever move. In the ancient Greek world, statues, temples, and sacred places were, well, they were just that, they were sacred. Nobody could be harmed if they sought sanctuary with the gods, no matter what they'd done. The whole city of Athens wanted to put Cylon to death for his crimes, but as long as he was seeking the protection of Athena, he could not be harmed, lest they upset the goddess. Eventually, one of the archons stepped forward, a man called Megacles, who was a member of the Alcmaeonid family, and he promised the plotters that if they left the statue of Athena, nobody needed to die. They would still stand trial, and they would probably get some gentler punishment for their crimes, exile or something like that, but nobody would be put to death. Seeing no other options, the plotters left the sanctuary of the statue and surrendered themselves. But, contrary to the promise that he'd made, as soon as the plotters were away from the sanctuary and in the hands of Megacles the Alcmaeonid, he put all of them to death. He massacred the lot of them. This freed Athens from the threat of tyranny and from Cylon, but it came at a heavy personal price for Megacles and his family. From here on out, in all of Greek history, the Alcmaeonid clan will be considered a cursed bloodline. Curses were a very serious business for the ancient Greeks. They considered feuds, crimes, and divine justice to be hereditary. If your grandfather was a real bastard, there was a good chance that the gods were going to punish you for his crimes, simply on the merit of being his grandchild. Nevertheless, the Alcmaeonids remained a powerful family in Athens. Initially, at least, the Alcmaeonids were friends and allies of Pisistratus and the Tyranny. Very early in his political career, Pisistratus had even made a political marriage to the daughter of a prominent Alcmaeonid. But he doesn't seem to have done this all that enthusiastically. Pisistratus went to great lengths to avoid having any children with this new wife of his. He already had plenty of kids from his first marriage, and besides, any new children he had with this Alcmaeonid woman might be tainted by the curse. Ooh. According to Herodotus, the way that Pisistratus avoided having any children by his new wife is that he didn't have sex with her in the usual way. Feel free to let your imaginations run absolutely wild regarding what that might mean. And his new wife found this bizarre, and she told her mother about it, and her mother then told her husband about it, and he was furious. This bedroom drama created a rift between the Tyranny and the Alcmaeonid family. And whilst it appears that at least some of the cursed family stayed in Athens, most of them were either driven out or went into voluntary exile, where they would plot their return. An opportunity for revenge presented itself to the Alcmaeonids in the form of a building contract. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi, the oracle, the most sacred and important religious site in the whole Greek world, had burned down. You know, how's that for divine favour? And the Alcmaeonids managed to get themselves the contract to rebuild the temple. And to do this, they mobilised all of their wealth and fortune. They poured huge amounts of resources into making a new temple that it was even bigger and more impressive than the one that had stood there before it. And they coated the whole thing in the finest marble in the whole Greek world, from the island of Paros. This generosity bought the Alcmaeonids an enormous amount of clout with the oracle at Delphi, a place that pretty much every community in Greece visited for advice. And a prestigious, ancient, and sacred site like Delphi wasn't above a little bit of bribery. In return for their services, all the Alcmaeonids asked from the oracle is that they advise everyone who passed through to do everything in their power to liberate the Athenians from tyranny. This had a particular impact on the Spartans. Sparta was, at the time, the most powerful state in Greece, and its king, Cleomenes, was already pretty suspicious of the Pisistratid tyranny. He didn't like that they were cozying up so close to his main rival, the city of Argos. So when he visited the oracle at Delphi, and the Pythia told him he ought to do everything in his power to depose the tyranny in Athens, the king of Sparta did not need that much encouragement. The first Spartan invasion was a complete failure, but the second invasion, led personally by King Cleomenes himself, was far more successful. Cleomenes besieged Hippias on the Acropolis of Athens, and to the horror of the tyrant, his own people, tired of his reign of terror, joined the invaders. Seeing that all might be lost, Hippias turned to the safety of his friends and family, and he attempted to have his children smuggled out of the city. But agents of the Spartans found them and captured them, and fearing for his children's lives, Hippias was persuaded to surrender. He was given 5 days to gather his possessions and leave Athens and go into exile. Hooray! The tyranny is over. The reign of terror is done. Hippias is deposed and exiled from the city. Success! We can all go back to normal now, right? Well, yes we can. Athens can go right back to normal. Unfortunately, normal for the ancient Athenians at this point was a state of political chaos, social division, and aristocratic infighting. You know, just like it had been before the tyranny. In this new round of political violence, 2 men rose up to become the main competitors for power in post-tyrannical Athens. The first was Cleisthenes, the champion of the Alcmaeonid family, that cursed bloodline that had bribed the Delphic oracle to overthrow the Pisistratids. And the second was a guy called Isagoras, who was an old friend of the tyrants. Yet again, Athens found itself a battleground between 2 opposing aristocratic factions. Now Cleisthenes, the Alcmaeonid, was favoured by the majority of the Athenian people, but Isagoras was favoured by King Cleomenes of Sparta. The 2 of them were good friends, and they might even have done a little bit of wife swapping from time to time. And Cleomenes was dead keen to see an ally of his in power in Athens. Consequently, the Spartans marched into the city, occupied it, and put him in power. Cleomenes and Isagoras teamed up to drive Cleisthenes and the Alcmaeonids back into exile, along with about 700 other Athenian families that posed a threat to their new regime. They then began undoing laws and dissolving institutions. The Boule, that council of 400 that Solon had founded so that the average Athenian might have a say in the governance of his city, was given an order to disband. It looked to everybody that the Spartans were setting up a new regime, a new tyranny to rule the city, one that was even more authoritarian than the one that had come beforehand. After all, with all of his rivals dead or exiled, Isagoras and his 300 closest supporters could rule over the city without opposition. That was the idea, at least. But neither Isagoras nor the Spartans counted on the will of the Athenian people. These people had endured the abuses of greedy landlords. They had lived in a city torn apart by infighting, and they had survived the brutal tyranny and the reign of terror that Hippias had imposed on them. And now they were seeing what little security they had won for themselves in the last 100 years being stripped away from them. No, the Athenian people were done with just lying down and taking it. When Isagoras ordered the Boule to disband, it refused, and the plethora of the Athenians took to the streets in protest. In the violence that followed, Isagoras, Cleomenes, and the Spartan occupiers were driven to the Acropolis, the great rock in the centre of the city, on the top of which stood the temple to Athena, and that's where they would be besieged. Spartans loved to make a big deal about how they never surrendered. They fought and died to the last. And if battle had been joined between the Athenian people and the Spartan occupiers, maybe that's what would have happened. But battle didn't need to be joined. The Athenians knew that there was no food or water on the Acropolis. They didn't have to fight the Spartans, they just had to wait. After 2 days of siege, the Spartans admitted defeat. Cleomenes and Isagoras were allowed to leave the city, but their ambitions of ever ruling it had been well and truly thwarted. The Athenian people, who now had control of Athens again, put their trust in Cleisthenes the Alcmaeonid, who was brought back from exile. But the Athenians did not choose Cleisthenes to rule over them. They chose Cleisthenes to help them rule themselves. The task he was given was to rebuild the Athenian state in a way that ensured the problems of the past never reared their ugly heads again. The Athenians needed a proper constitution, a robust one that protected them from the abuses of landlords, from aristocratic infighting, and from the rise of tyrants. All of that could never be allowed to happen again. And in doing this, Cleisthenes would push Solon's reforms, Solon's ideas, even further towards democracy. The first thing that Cleisthenes did was mix the people up. Attica, the land of Athens, was traditionally divided into 4 tribes. This was a long-established division of the people, and it came with ancient loyalties and ancient rivalries. Cleisthenes wanted to smash these old loyalties and these old resentments, and to do that, he divided his people up into even smaller groups. Okay, stay with me here, because this is going to get ever so slightly confusing. From here on out, there would be 10 tribes in Attica. Each tribe would be made up of 3 trities, a further subdivision, and each trity would be made up of several demes. Let's start with the smallest of these divisions, the demes. Demes were hamlets, villages, small communities. They were the most local loyalty that an ancient Athenian had, their most immediate political unit. In Aristotle's day, the Athenians were known to refer to themselves by their deme, as opposed to by their father's name, as was common practice in the rest of Greece. So, for example, a regular Greek might say, "Hello, I'm Cimon, son of Aristides," whilst an Athenian would say, "I'm Cimon of the deme of Arcania." We don't know exactly how many demes Cleisthenes established, but we do know that about 150 years later, in the time of Aristotle, there were 140 demes across the whole of Attica. So we're talking about a very, very small division here. And each deme was labelled as either a coastal, rural, or urban deme. Cleisthenes then took collections of rural demes, urban demes, and coastal demes, and he shoved them together into a larger administrative unit called a trity. So each trity was a collection of Athenian communities from the main 3 landscapes of Attica, the countryside, the coast, and the city. There were 30 of these trities in total. Then, 3 trities would be combined to create a tribe. So there were 10 tribes of Attica now to replace the old historic 4 tribes. And these 10 tribes would be the political units by which the new Athenian democracy would govern itself. Because of the way that the trities had been put together, each tribe included people from all elements of Athenian society. The tribes weren't divided up by geography, by wealth, or by nobility. No, instead they were a cross-section of society, including people of all professions, all classes, and all regions of Attica. In times of war, each tribe would elect a strategos, a general or a leader, and the tribesmen would fight side by side. By doing this, Cleisthenes smashed pre-existing loyalties across Attica and created new ones. He broke up the blocks of power and influence, and he forever changed the face of Athenian society. In Aristotle's day, if you asked an Athenian about his heritage and his family's history, he will sternly respond with the saying, "Do not judge a man by his tribe." The Boule, the Council of 400 that Solon had introduced, was expanded to fit 500 members. Each tribe would elect 50 representatives to be part of their prytany, their members of the Boule, who would govern the city day to day and decide the agenda for the ecclesia. The ecclesia, or the assembly of citizens, was open to any Athenian who held citizenship. About 40 times a year, the ecclesia would meet in the Nix, a hill on the outskirts of Athens, and they would discuss, debate, and vote on policy. The ecclesia had existed before in Athenian history. It had been around for generations, but it had never been all that important to the governance of the city. But after Cleisthenes' reforms, the ecclesia will become the centre of Athenian political life. This is the beginning of Athenian democracy. Sort of, kinda. If you ask a historian, they'll probably tell you that the truly radical, democratic democracy that Athens is famous for won't reach its final form for another 4 or 5 decades, not until the reforms of Ephialtes. But if you asked an ancient Athenian, when is it that your city became a democracy, they would point to the reforms of Cleisthenes and say that was the moment that the people took over the governance of the city. Herodotus, who spends very little time on the details of this story, says that Cleisthenes was the man who gave the Athenians their democracy, which sounds like this was a very decisive moment, like one day there was tyranny and the next day there was democracy. Aristotle, writing in the mid to late 4th century BCE, shows a little bit more nuance in his discussion of the topic. He says that Cleisthenes built on the reforms of Solon to make them more democratic, and in Aristotle's version of events, the whole 6th century BCE is effectively the story of democracy gradually developing in Athens, as the people bit by bit wrestle power away from the aristocracy and disperse it amongst themselves. I also think that the regular Athenian people themselves deserve quite a lot of the credit here. It was they that caused uproar at the abuses of landowners and landlords, the kind of uproar that forced Solon to step in and build them a more robust state. It was they that joined with the Spartans in overthrowing Hippias and the tyranny, and it was they, without the help or leadership of the aristocrats, who were all in exile at the time, who rose up against the Spartans and Isagoras, who were occupying their city, and besieged them on the Acropolis, determined not to let their city fall into another autocracy. Looked at a certain way, Athenian democracy could be as much the product of a people's revolution, as much as it is the brainchild of a great state builder like Solon or Cleisthenes. The motivations of Cleisthenes are worth questioning here. In Herodotus' narrative, it's kind of implied that Cleisthenes is actually a little bit cynical, that he's only giving in to the people's demands for a more democratic system because he sees it as the only way of winning his ongoing political battle with Isagoras. It's possible that Cleisthenes did not give a damn about democracy or about the rights of the people and the citizens. He just saw aligning himself with their interests as the most obvious step to take in his ongoing aristocratic feud. Aristotle is a little bit more generous. In his version of events, Cleisthenes is motivated by a genuine desire to see Athens free from tyranny, not just now, but also in the future. Aristotle's Cleisthenes is less ambitious nobleman and more intelligent state builder. Who knows? Maybe Cleisthenes was a ruthless political ladder climber, or maybe he was an altruistic visionary, a reformer with a democratic agenda. Usually we might be able to decipher something of the man's motivations based on what he did next. Perhaps his future actions might reveal something of his intentions. But alas, Cleisthenes disappears from history. He reforms the Athenian government, founds their democracy, and then just drops completely off the historical scene. After the year 507 BCE, there is no knowing what happened to Cleisthenes the Alcmaeonid. Maybe he died, Or maybe he was the ultimate democratic reformer who removed himself from the political scene intentionally because he sensed that he would have too much personal influence and he wanted his democracy to get off to a good, balanced start. Or maybe he took a leaf out of Solon's book and just went to go and travel the world. But before leaving the historical scene, Cleisthenes left the Athenian people one last gift, one final reform that would shape Athenian history for generations to come: the Law of Ostracism. Every year, the Ecclesia, the People's Assembly, that most democratic institution in the state, would vote on whether or not to exile somebody. That person didn't have to commit a crime, they didn't have to be guilty of anything, they just had to be unpopular. If the Ecclesia voted yes, then every Athenian citizen had the opportunity to nominate somebody for exile. To do this, they would write that person's name on a fragment of broken pottery. These pieces of broken pottery were called ostraka, hence the term ostracism. And if more than 6,000 Athenian citizens voted for that person to be ostracized, they would have to go into exile for 10 years. If they returned before that 10-year period was done, they would be put to death. But once the 10-year term was up, they could return home. Aristotle tells us that the main reason for this bizarre practice was fear that the tyranny might return. The Athenian people, who had just endured years living under Hippias's reign of terror, were very paranoid that once again one person might gain enough personal influence and power to seize control of their city. Ostracism prevented this. If one person was ever becoming too powerful or too influential, the demos, the people, might choose to ostracize him as a preemptive measure. And so, armed with their new constitution, their new tribes, and their new law of ostracism, the young Athenian democracy ventured out into the world. But it was a very dangerous world. The Spartans, for one, were not happy at having been humiliated and kicked out of the city. King Cleomenes still dreamed of installing a pro-Spartan regime in Athens, and the democracy stood in the way of his ambitions. At home, there were many Athenians that agreed with the Spartans, the aristocracy to start with, who had traditionally held all of the political power in Athens, a system that was right and just according to their worldview. Now they were being forced to share power with the great, uneducated and unwashed masses. And worse, the power of imposing exile, traditionally an aristocratic tool, had now been given over to the regular people. Athens' traditional nobility could only sit back and watch as their friends and allies were driven into exile, for no other reason than they had been friendly with the tyrants. And abroad, those tyrants still lived. Word soon reached the Athenians that Hippias sought refuge at the court of the Persians, that great and terrible empire that lay to the east. No doubt he dreamed of one day restoring his family to power, and with the help of the Persian king, that dream might become a reality. And then, a visitor arrived in the city. He was a man from Miletus, and he brought with him a great bronze map of the known world. And he had a proposal for the Athenian people. Sparta is fairly tricky for historians. For such a well-known state, and one that features so prominently in our sources and in our story, they can also be quite mysterious. Lots of people write about the Spartans, but very few of them were alive during Sparta's heyday, and even fewer of them were Spartan themselves. Sparta's early history is especially difficult. Our ancient sources can't seem to agree on exactly what happened or when, and therefore modern scholars have an equally difficult time piecing together anything that resembles an accurate picture of what early Sparta may have looked like. Which is a real shame, because archaic Sparta was probably really interesting. It was these centuries, roughly the 9th to the 6th century BCE, where Sparta went from being an insignificant collection of villages on the Peloponnese to being the most powerful and the most unique state in all of Greece. And you know, it would be nice to know exactly how that happened. So let's start with the simple stuff. Sparta is here, in a part of Greece called the Peloponnese, or the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and in a part of the Peloponnese called Laconia. This is why the Spartans are sometimes referred to as Lacedaemonians. Now, people tend to use the words Spartan and Lacedaemonian more or less interchangeably, which is something I'm also going to be doing. But there is a subtle difference between the two, a difference that we'll get into a bit later. The catalyst for Sparta's transformation from a place that Herodotus once said had the worst customs in all of Greece into regional superpower came from two places. The first was a lawgiver, a man who the Spartans credited as the founder of their unique social order. And the second, rather fittingly for the best soldiers in all of Greece, was a war. Let's start with the lawgiver, a man called Lycurgus, the guy who founded the Spartan way of life and gave them their political constitution. We know very little about Lycurgus, and what we do know is probably wrong. It's not that we don't have any sources about the man, we have plenty. Plutarch even dedicates an entire biography to him. It's just that we can't be sure what to believe. Plutarch begins his biography, The Life of Lycurgus, by stating that there is nothing that can be said about the man that someone somewhere out there won't dispute. We have numerous contradictory accounts about his life, and none of them really add up with one another. Our sources can't even agree on when he was born or when he died. In fact, there are nearly 5 centuries of wiggle room when it comes to dating the life of Lycurgus. That is, if he ever really existed at all, which is also doubtful. The only thing that we can say with even a degree of certainty is that if you asked a Spartan in the classical era, why is Sparta the way that it is, their answer would probably be, because Lycurgus made it so. Lycurgus, the great lawgiver, was credited with founding the Spartan way of life. Pretty much all of it. Which is probably untrue. The Spartan way of life that we're about to get into was probably the result of a gradual development, in the same way that Athenian democracy, as we discussed in the last chapter, was the result of several decisions and changes made over the course of many generations. But that's not what the Spartans believed. They believed it was practically all down to Lycurgus. The first of these reforms was Sparta's political constitution. Sparta stood out amongst the Greek cities at the time in that it was ruled by kings. Most Greek cities didn't have kings. They were ruled by oligarchic councils or by tyrants, strong men who seized power. By the time of our story, dynastic kings with royal lineages that stretched back for centuries had largely died out in ancient Greece, or they'd been absorbed into the magistracies of a new constitution. For example, in Athens, before the founding of the democracy, the city was governed, officially at least, by 9 elected archons, and one of these 9 archons was called the Archon Basilius. Basilius is the ancient Greek word for king, and in Athens this specific magistrate had responsibilities mostly tied to ancient religious traditions. This suggests that possibly, in Athens, the kingship had over time morphed into something more like a priesthood. But Sparta still had kings. That's kings plural, by the way, there were 2 of them at any given time, from 2 different royal families, the Eurypontids and the Agiads. Now, traditionally, the Agiads were the senior royal family, but constitutionally, they were both equal, both of them acting as a check on the other one's power. In the Spartan constitution, the kings had numerous duties. To start with, they were priests. They held 2 priesthoods, one of Zeus of Lacedaemon and one of heavenly Zeus. So they were priests of Zeus. They also had very, very specific legal duties. They were in charge of heiresses, women who inherited, building roads and the adoption of male children. Very, very specific legal matters like that. In wartime, the Spartan kings acted as commanders-in-chief. They were always the first to leave Sparta on campaign and the last to return. Aristotle tells us that this was the main duty of a Spartan king, and that in Sparta, the kingship is more like a generalship than anything else. The Spartan kings also enjoyed various social privileges. They were the first to eat at feasts, and they got a larger portion than anybody else did. Each king reserved the right to appoint 2 personal Pythians, messengers to the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, who acted as personal envoys between the king and the god. And when a Spartan king died, the entirety of Sparta ground to a halt for 10 whole days so that the city could mourn. And if that king died in battle, then wow, he could expect to have a statue made of himself in the city, which was a rare extravagance for the austere Spartans. The 2 kings also sat on the Gerousia, the council of elders that governed Sparta. It was made up of 30 individuals, the 2 kings and then 28 other chosen nobles, all above the age of 60. The Gerousia acted as the highest court in Sparta, with the power to prosecute, exile, or even execute any Spartan, including, on some occasions, even the kings. This council, the Gerousia, would discuss, debate, and decide on important matters of state, with each member of the council getting 1 vote. Apart from the kings, they both got 2 votes, but that still gave a united council more power than both of the kings, acting as an important check on royal authority. It was also the responsibility of the Gerousia to decide the agenda to be discussed in the Spartan ecclesia. The Gerousia and the ecclesia in Sparta are very similar in their functions to the boule and the ecclesia in Athens. Every Spartan citizen had the right to attend the ecclesia and make his opinion known on matters of state. But within reason. Unlike the Athenian assembly, which was alive with discussion, the Spartan assembly was forbidden from making motions of its own or debating motions that had been put forward by the king and council. Plutarch says this was to prevent the regular Spartans from manipulating the words of the councillors or seeking to use the assembly to forward their own personal goals. The Spartan ecclesia was not a place to practice public speaking or kickstart a political career. It was a place where citizens voted either yes or no on matters that had already been decided by the king and the council. So there we have it. Sparta's constitution, a delicate balance between the 3 main government types in ancient Greece. There was an element of monarchy in there, in the form of the kings and the 2 royal families. There was a sprinkling of oligarchy in the form of the Gerousia, the Council of 30. And there was just a dab of democracy, which came in the form of the ecclesia, the People's Assembly. Each of Lycurgus's reforms acted as a check on the power of the other. The kings, though immensely influential in themselves, could not act against the wishes of the Gerousia, the council, and the council always had to bear in mind the thoughts and feelings of the damos, the regular citizenry, who would make their will known in the ecclesia. Much like Rome's republic, the Spartans seem to have found a recipe for stability in blending several governmental types. But there was one more element to this bizarre Spartan system: the Ephors. Every year, the Spartan citizenry would elect 5 Ephors from amongst their number. The Ephors didn't have to come from royal lineage, they didn't have to be part of the council or anything like that. Any Spartan citizen could be elected to the Ephorate. And once they were in office, constitutionally at least, the Ephors were almost equal to the kings in their power. It was the Ephors that ran the city of Sparta on a day-to-day basis. It was the Ephors that implemented the will of the council and the ecclesia. It was the Ephors that acted as judges in most legal disputes, and it was the Ephors who kept a close eye on all the other Spartan officials and magistrates to make sure that they were acting in a just and honest manner. If they found that any of these officials were acting in a way that was unbefitting of a Spartan, it was the Ephors who hauled them before the Gerousia for prosecution, and if found guilty, it was the Ephors who would depose, exile, or even execute them. Even the kings weren't safe from this. Any time they went on campaign, they did so accompanied by 2 Ephors, who would keep a close eye on the king and made sure he acted as a Spartan king should. In a certain sense, the Ephors were the most powerful men in the city. So this is the Spartan Constitution as we understand it, which, as I mentioned earlier, isn't necessarily correct, because we have practically no Spartan sources dating from this era. But it wasn't just the Spartan political constitution that made the place so unique. It was also its distinct and strict social structure. I mentioned earlier that Spartans are often referred to as Lacedaemonians, and that the words Spartan and Lacedaemonian are often used more or less interchangeably, even though there is a subtle difference. That difference has everything to do with class. Everyone who lived within the region of Laconia was a Lacedaemonian, but not every Lacedaemonian was a Spartan. To be a Spartan, you had to come from Sparta's ruling class. The ruling class of Sparta called themselves the homoioi, or the equals. Lycurgus, amongst his other achievements, was supposedly the one to define exactly what it meant to be a member of the homoioi, a true Spartan. To be a Spartan, a young Lacedaemonian would be taken away from his parents at a young age, about 5 or 6, and put into a state education system called the agoge. Now, in many ways, the agoge resembled the typical school experience. You'd leave your house in the morning, you'd spend most of your day being taught, being educated, and then you'd return home to your parents at night. But as well as the usual school stuff, learning to read and write and count, the agoge had a few other unique aspects to it. It was a violent and militaristic education, designed to create the perfect, obedient little citizens. In the early 4th century, an Athenian called Xenophon moved to Sparta and witnessed the agoge firsthand. He describes an education system that was designed to toughen young Spartan boys. They would be beaten, they would be denied proper clothing, and they would be underfed to encourage them to steal in order to sustain themselves. Of course, if they were ever caught stealing, they would be harshly punished by the very same teachers who had encouraged them to steal in the first place. This was to teach them cunning, to make sure that they wouldn't be caught a second time. But the overarching theme of the agoge was indoctrination. It was designed to create perfect, obedient little citizens whose first loyalty would not be to their families or to their clan, but to the state. By being educated publicly by the state, as opposed to by their parents or families, as was presumably the case elsewhere in Greece, the agoge served Sparta in roughly the same way that Cleisthenes' tribal reforms had served Athens. It broke up old loyalties, it disbanded factions, and it created a sense of unity. And it imbued Spartan boys with the idea that their first loyalty, their primary identity, was their political and social one. As a Spartan, as a member of the homoioi, that trumped all other identities, including familial ones. Xenophon praises the sense of conformity and obedience that was inspired by the agoge. He's especially impressed by the fact that young Spartans have a real respect for authority, and the authority of the entire state, not just their parents or elder relatives, because it was the entire state that had educated them. It was the entire state that had cared for them, and it was the state that doled out rewards and punishments. And when the Spartan boy grew up, if he was considered worthy by his elders, he would be moved to the Sysotia, the communal mess hall. Once a part of this club, he was officially a Spartan, one of the homoioi, the equals, a member of Sparta's warrior aristocracy. It's important to remember that this was not the typical experience of the average person born in Laconia. To be a member of the Spartan club, to go through the agoge and be invited to the Sysotia, was predicated on a few things: heritage, breeding, and wealth. This was not just a gathering of elite warriors. It was a private members' club for the ultra-wealthy, who were a minority in Sparta. These true Spartans, the Spartiates, the homoioi, made up the top echelon of Spartan society. The 2 kings, the gerousia, and the citizens who could attend the ecclesia. But below them were a massive class of people called the perioikoi, which means those who dwell nearby. Perioikoi were just standard, regular old Greeks who didn't go through the bizarre Spartan education system or any of their weird rituals. They were professionals, they were sculptors, blacksmiths, things like that. They had no say in politics, and they were beholden to the whim of the Spartan nobility, but they were free. And then, below them, there were the Helots. I mentioned earlier that Sparta was made unique by two things. The first was this semi-mythical lawgiver, Lycurgus, the man who the Spartans credited as being the inventor of their weird way of doing things. And the second was a war, or rather, two wars, with their neighbours, the Messenians. At some point in the 8th or 7th centuries BCE, the Lacedaemonians had gone to war with and conquered their westerly neighbours, the Messenians, and this gave Sparta the largest territory of any state in Greece. Masses and masses of land that needed to be worked. But who would work the land? According to Lycurgus's reforms, a Spartan citizen was prohibited from doing any work whatsoever. They were a leisurely class who never exerted themselves outside of war, where they were expected to act as soldiers. So who would work the land? Well, what the Spartans did is they enslaved the Messenian peoples, and probably also a fair few of their own Lacedaemonian people, and created a new underclass called the Helots. Helots were slaves owned by the Spartan state who worked the land to enrich the Spartan nobility. Now, slavery was pretty much universal amongst all of the ancient Greek cities. As far as I know, there wasn't a single Greek state that didn't engage in slavery to some degree or another. It was also pretty much ubiquitous across all of the surrounding civilizations as well. You'll have a hard time in the ancient world finding anywhere that doesn't have slavery. That's not what made Spartan slavery unique. What made Spartan slavery unique was the particular way that the Helots were treated and how they interacted with their Spartan masters. To start with, there were loads of them. About 7 Helots for every 1 Spartan citizen, if Herodotus is to be believed. As a result of this, Sparta existed in an almost constant state of paranoia that their own enslaved underclass might rise up in rebellion and overthrow them with sheer numbers. This was not an unfounded fear either. Helot revolts are actually a pretty common feature of Spartan history, and although the Spartans were pretty much always victorious when it came to stamping them out, these revolts were always catastrophic. To keep the Helots in line, the Spartans treated them incredibly harshly. Even by the standards of slavers and the enslaved. Plutarch tells us that they would every year ritually declare war on their own slaves and massacre them in large numbers in order to keep the population low. And they would also engage in the ritual humiliation of Helots in order to constantly remind them that they were lesser. There was a strong ideological flavour to Spartan cruelty. For example, whenever they engaged in their yearly ritual massacres of the Helots, they would select for death the strongest and healthiest looking from amongst the enslaved population. After all, if your massive and incredibly cruel slave system is built on the very genuine belief that you are better, stronger, and superior to these people, having living examples to the contrary, big strong Helots, might prove problematic. Thucydides, a 5th century Athenian writer, tells us that sometimes when wars got particularly desperate, the Spartans would arm the Helot population and march off to war with them. Sometimes the Helots would fight side by side with the Spartans, and on one particular occasion in the late 5th century, the Helots fought really well. They fought bravely, they drove the enemy back, and the Spartans were left in an awkward position. They had to thank their own slaves. And as a reward, these Helots were given their freedom, all 2,000 of them, and the Spartans adorned them with garlands of flowers. And then these 2,000 freed Helots were given a Spartan escort back home. Not a single one of those Helots ever made it back to Sparta. They disappeared en route. There was no way that the Spartans were going to let these people go home and live amongst them as freedmen, as living examples that these people could ever be equals. This is the great weirdness, the great contradiction at the heart of Spartan culture. The emphasis on equality that was the cornerstone of their ideology only applied to the small percentage of people that qualified for homoioi status, a tiny club of aristocrats obsessed with conformity who declared themselves to be equals. But they were only equals in that they were all equally superior to everybody else. To other Greek cities, many of whom admired Sparta for its military prowess and its stability, this was an unfortunate mark against them. The Spartans could often come across as snobbish, sneering, and a bit superior, probably because they genuinely believed that about themselves and really were. The Spartans did not care about anything that wasn't Spartan, and other Greeks, especially the newly democratic Athenians, did not appreciate being treated as inferiors by a bunch of snobbish aristos who thought that they were all that just because they could do a lot of push-ups. Plutarch repeats a saying that was common in ancient Greece. In Sparta, a free man is freer than anywhere else in the world, and a slave is more a slave. Greek history is just filled with lovely examples of the Spartans failing to play nice with other Greeks. In the late 5th century, Sparta will take the lead in founding a massive colony, a pan-Hellenic colony, a new city that'll be a utopia for people from all around Greece. And this colony is just a complete disaster, mostly because the Greeks who arrive to take part in it cannot tolerate being ruled by the arrogant and the unjust Spartans. A few decades later, in the early 4th century, Sparta will become the dominant state in Greece, the hegemonic power. But it won't last long, because they lose the support of many of their closest allies, largely because, as Plutarch puts it, the Spartans do not know how to govern free men. Okay, so that's the Spartans. A militaristic culture with a bizarre constitution and a strictly regimented class system based on the inherent superiority of the homoioi, the Spartan elite, and the mistreatment of a massive enslaved underclass. We think. I really want to emphasize again here how little we know for sure about early Sparta. Our sources for this era are far from perfect and far from impartial. Pretty much all of them are foreigners, visitors to Sparta, who are looking at their secretive society from the outside in. And pretty much all of these writers have agendas of their own, political ideologies to push, grudges to argue, things like that. Things that might influence or colour how they portray the Spartans. Not to mention, none of them lived in the era that we are now talking about. This means that practically nothing can be said for certain about the Spartans. Pretty much any little fact or bit of trivia that you might have picked up about them can be disputed. For example, one of the most famous little factoids about ancient Sparta is that they liked to chuck imperfect babies from the top of a hill. But that appears in none of our ancient sources until Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus. That is the only written source from the ancient era which mentions this practice, and it was written centuries after Sparta ceased to exist as a state. That's just to give you an idea of the kind of difficulties that historians are faced with here. I really like the way that historian Jonathan Hall puts it. He says that if we approach our sources regarding ancient Athens with caution, we should assign to sources discussing ancient Sparta a formal warning. But enough about who the Spartans may or may not have been. Why are they important to our story? Well, in the 6th century BCE, whilst Pisistratus was taking power in Athens, and whilst the Persian Empire was being born in the mountains of Iran, Sparta was busy conquering and making itself the most powerful Greek city on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. This was not an easy process for the Spartans. Sure, they were often victorious, but they also suffered some devastating setbacks, especially at the hands of the cities of Tegea and Argos. Especially Argos. Argos hated Sparta. The Argives and the Spartans are always dead set against one another. But eventually, most of the Peloponnese bowed to Spartan dominance. Sparta was now the most powerful state in all of Greece, and this sets the stage for one of the most interesting Spartan kings, Cleomenes. Cleomenes was an unconventional king with unconventional origins. His somewhat controversial birth would be the source of a good deal of infighting between the Spartan royal families. Cleomenes' father was a Spartan king called Anaxandridas. Now, Anaxandridas was a good king who looked after a happy city, full of happy citizens. You know, apart from the massively mistreated and enormous enslaved Helot class, obviously. But other than them, everyone was happy. And Anaxandridas was also happy in his family life. He was very much in love with his wife, which is nice. But there was a problem here. Anaxandridas and his wife had no children, and this could cause problems later on, lest a succession crisis jeopardize the security of Sparta. The Ephors begged the king to please divorce his wife, set her aside, and take a new woman who might provide you children. But Anaxandridas was dedicated to his wife. He loved her a good deal, and he refused to do this. And so the Ephors consented to something that had never happened before in Spartan history, and with good reason would never happen again. They allowed Anaxandridas to take a second wife. But the situation soon turned complicated. The new wife quickly got pregnant, but then the old wife, the one who had failed to conceive for years and years, became pregnant at more or less the same time. This created an intense rivalry between the families of each spouse. Accusations of faking pregnancies started being launched in all directions, and anxieties over whether or not the babies would be boys or girls, or which ones would be born first, started to take root. In the end, Cleomenes was born first, to the king's first wife, shortly before his half-brother Dorieus. The Ephors watched both births very closely to make sure there wasn't any sneaky baby swapping. But in the end, Cleomenes, as the elder by only a few days, was declared his father's heir. The second wife would end up having 3 sons: Dorieus, Cleombrotus, and Leonidas. Yes, that Leonidas, the famous one, Gerard Butler. We'll get to him in future videos. But it was the eldest of these 3 brothers, Dorieus, who had missed out on being the heir by only a few days, who ended up feeling embittered towards his half-brother. Herodotus, who tells us this story, seems to be setting up Cleomenes and Dorieus as rivals. But the problem of Dorieus very quickly solves itself. He gets fed up with playing second fiddle to the half-brother that he doesn't really like, and he leaves Sparta and goes to Sicily to become a mercenary, and he ends up being killed in a fairly unimportant battle, and that's the end of Dorieus. With his main rival having fairly helpfully dispatched himself, Cleomenes could set about ruling Sparta, and his policies were aggressive and interventionalist. When he came to power, Sparta was already the most powerful state in Greece, and as its king, that made him, Cleomenes, the most powerful man in Greece. And he started to act like it. Cleomenes spent his rule taking the Spartan army abroad and intervening in the politics of other cities, generally with an aim to install a regime that would favour him and Sparta. We've already seen how he did this in Athens. The Pisistratids, the tyranny that ruled there, were closely aligned with the city of Argos, which was Sparta's rival. So Cleomenes invaded Attica and helped the Athenians overthrow the Pisistratids. He then tried to install an ally and personal friend of his, Isagoras, in power in Athens, and leave it as a sort of puppet of Sparta. Now, as we saw in the last chapter, this didn't go especially well. He and his men were besieged on the Acropolis, and eventually Cleisthenes came in and founded a democracy. But Athens was not the only city that Cleomenes tried to intervene in. If you lived in southern Greece in the late 6th century BCE, there was a fairly good chance that at some point Cleomenes and his buddies would turn up in your community and start making demands. Some cities submitted to Sparta quickly, others resisted. But Cleomenes' main rival would not come from one of these foreign cities, it would come from within Sparta. As we went through earlier, Sparta had this weird and quite difficult to define constitution, and one of the most bizarre elements of this was its monarchy, or more properly, I should say it's duarchy, because Sparta had two kings. Cleomenes did not rule alone. He had a colleague called Demaratus, and Demaratus hated Cleomenes. Herodotus doesn't tell us why, but it's not hard to imagine. Cleomenes doesn't seem like the kind of guy who played nicely with others. And as time went on, this resentment deepened, until eventually Demaratus openly worked against his co-king. When Cleomenes had first marched on Athens, Demaratus had refused to support him and undermined the whole campaign. When Cleomenes tried to exert influence over the island of Aegina, the locals resisted him, brandishing a letter from Demaratus claiming that Cleomenes was acting outside the will and the interests of the Spartan people. And whenever Cleomenes went away on campaign or went away to war, Demaratus would stay in Sparta and use the opportunity to slander his fellow monarch. Eventually, this all got too much, and Cleomenes decisively acted against his colleague. He prosecuted Demaratus publicly, claiming that he was not a legitimate king. Cleomenes even fairly openly bribed the Pythia, the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, the most sacred site in the whole Greek world, to say that Demaratus was not the real son of the last king of Sparta. Okay, so we need a little bit of context regarding Demaratus's parentage. This is the story that Herodotus gives us. There was once a truly hideous child, a little girl who was so disgusting to look upon, people couldn't even bear to do it. Obviously, the parents of this child were distraught at having such a hideous baby, and they wanted to do something about it. One day, this girl's nurse took her to a sanctuary of Helen to pray that the goddess take away her disgusting looks and leave her beautiful. It makes sense to do this at a sanctuary of Helen. Helen, who was the mother of all Greeks, was supposedly an ex-queen of Sparta whose good looks were so legendary that she was kidnapped by Paris of Troy, and this kick-started the mythical Trojan War. Helen was the face that launched 1,000 ships. So there's this nurse and this very ugly baby, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, there appears a mysterious woman that nobody recognizes, and she asks to hold the baby. And the nurse goes, yeah, there you are, go ahead. And with one swish of her hand, the mysterious woman magically takes away the hideous ugliness of this child and leaves her looking beautiful. And when she grows up, this woman is known as the most gorgeous in all of Sparta. Demaratus's father, the Spartan king Ariston, wanted to marry this woman. But there was a problem, a little complication. She was already married to a man who was a friend of his. So the king tricks his friend into divorcing his wife so he can marry her instead. Soon enough, this woman, blessed by Helen, got pregnant and gave birth to a son. When the king heard this news, a messenger came to him whilst he was holding court and said, "Sire, sire, a son has been born to you." And the king quickly did some mental arithmetic, added some numbers together, and stood up and loudly proclaimed, "He cannot be mine!" It seemed to everybody that Ariston was rejecting his paternity of this child. But then very quickly, something changed. The king came to regret this comment, and he embraced the child as being his own, naming him Demaratus, the people's prayer. And this is the story that Cleomenes used to denounce his fellow king. He claimed that Ariston's statement, "He cannot be mine," was definitive proof that Demaratus was not the real son of the old Spartan king. Possibly Ariston chose to just ignore this and embrace him as his child because he had no sons of his own and just needed an heir. And this worked. Demaratus was removed from office and he was replaced as king by a relative of his, a guy called Leotychides. And Leotychides hated Demaratus because Demaratus a few years earlier had stolen his wife. I know, lots and lots of wife stealing happening in ancient Sparta. So when Leotychides became king, he took great pleasure in humiliating Demaratus. But one day, at a festival, Leotychides pushed things too far. Demaratus was present at this festival. After being deposed as king, he had stayed in Sparta as a regular citizen, and even gotten himself elected to a fairly senior magistracy, so he was overseeing the festival. And Leotychides, seeing this as a great opportunity to embarrass his old rival, went to him and asked, "Demaratus, tell me, what is it like to be a mere magistrate when you were once a king?" Demaratus, who was furious at this comment, turned to Leotychides and said, "With that comment, you have either brought great suffering or great joy to the city of Sparta." He then stormed off in a rage. Demaratus went back to his house, where he slaughtered an ox and then sent a message to his mother, summoning her. When his mother arrived, he took the ox's entrails and placed them in her hands, and told her to swear an oath to Zeus to tell him the truth. Who was his real father? Was his father Ariston, her second husband and the last king? Or was he the offspring of her first husband? Or even worse, some other man? Demaratus's mother promised to tell him the whole truth. She said that on the third night after their wedding, Ariston returned home from a feast. The couple had sex, and then afterwards, her husband had placed a garland of flowers around her neck. A few hours later, Ariston walks back through the door, looks at his wife and says, "Where did you get that garland of flowers?" This confuses the queen, and she says, "Well, you gave them to me earlier, don't you remember?" And Ariston says, No, that can't be possible. I haven't been home all day." The couple then consulted the priests, who traced the flowers to the grave of an ancient Spartan hero called Astrabacus. Astrabacus had been a Spartan prince who had lived 500 years previously. So, Demaratus's mother told him, "You are either the offspring of my husband, Ariston, who was a king, or you were the offspring of this 500-year-old Spartan prince who came back to life one night in the form of her husband to sleep with her and give her flowers. Either way, you are the descendant of Spartan royalty and a legitimate king, no matter what others might say." "Okay," says Demaratus, "but if Ariston knew this, why is it that when news of my birth was brought to him, he loudly proclaimed that I could not be his?" Demaratus's mother tells him that Ariston made this comment because men are so often ignorant of pregnancies and childbirth. When he heard that a son had been born to him, Ariston did some maths and realised that it was too early, and that this must be the son of her previous husband or something like that. But not all pregnancies are the same length. Some babies are born early or late. His mother then turns to Demaratus and says, "You were a 7-month baby, born prematurely," and that when she explained this to Ariston, he had realised his ignorance and embraced you as his own son. Upon hearing this, Demaratus left Sparta, which was very illegal. As a Spartan citizen, you couldn't just up and leave without permission, and so he had to flee from city to city across Greece, narrowly avoiding Cleomenes' agents for years and years, until eventually he ended up at the court of the Persian king Darius. The Persians honoured Demaratus. They invited him to the king's inner circle, and they told him that if he served Persia, he would one day again rule in Sparta. Cleomenes and Leotychides had done it. They'd won. They now ruled Sparta without the irritating distraction of half-brothers who didn't like you, or deposed and embittered former kings. But karma would come for both of them in the end. Leotychides went out on campaign and took some bribes, and he was caught doing this. The Spartans prosecuted the hell out of him for this corruption, and he was exiled to Tegea, where he died in shame. And Cleomenes went mad. Like, properly mad. Good old-fashioned mad. The really weird stuff. His madness took the amusing form of him wandering around Sparta, poking people in the eye with his stick. And the Spartans eventually got fairly sick of this. They'd been turning a blind eye to Cleomenes' more problematic tendencies for years now, and they decided it was finally time to arrest him. Herodotus gives us a fairly fun list of accounts from various Greeks regarding the source of Cleomenes' cognitive decline. Most Greeks accredited his madness to the fact that he had bribed the Pythia. He had sullied the sacred oracle of Apollo at Delphi by offering money to warp the words of the god, and this was justly punished with madness. The Athenians also reckon that it was sacrilege what did the king in. They say that when Cleomenes had invaded Attica, he cut down a sacred tree in the precinct of Eleusis, and his madness was divine punishment for this insult to the gods. The Argives, who hated the Spartans, had their own explanation. They said that when Cleomenes had gone to war with Argos, he had coaxed some of their soldiers into surrendering by promising them that none of them would be harmed. But when they fell into his hands and were disarmed, he had gone back on his word and massacred the lot of them. Only the Spartans found an explanation that wasn't supernatural. They said that the source of Cleomenes' madness lay in the fact that he had spent too much time with Scythians whilst fighting wars abroad, and they had taught him to drink wine undiluted. To the Spartans, Cleomenes' erratic behaviour had nothing to do with mental illness. It was all to do with chronic alcoholism, something he had learned from spending too much time with foreigners. This is a typically Spartan explanation, and lines up perfectly with their worldview and their ideology, one that is based entirely on total indoctrination and adherence to the Spartan way of doing things. Spending too much time abroad, listening to foreigners and talking with them, and being away from the perfect state of Sparta would inevitably corrupt you. You would find yourself infected by dangerous foreign ideas. Herodotus himself, for what it's worth, thinks that Cleomenes' madness came as a result of his unlawful deposition of Demaratus. You know, divine punishment. What did you expect? So Cleomenes, the Mad King, was locked away and kept under 24/7 guard to make sure that he couldn't poke out anyone else's eye with his stick. One day, supposedly, he convinced his guard to let him have a knife, somehow, and once he had the weapon in hand, Cleomenes viciously stabbed himself to death. That's what the Spartans told everyone, at least. Personally, I reckon they just quietly did away with their troublesome king and tried their best to forget about this whole sorry affair. That's just my thought, though. I'm pretty cynical about this kind of stuff. But before he died, Cleomenes was visited by a strange man from Miletus. This man came with a large bronze map of the known world, and he had a proposal for the king of Sparta. On the western coast of Asia, there lay the 12 cities of Ionia, a cluster of Greek cities hugging the coast of what is today Turkey, divided and quarrelsome, but united by a shared heritage, a familiar pantheon of gods, and an Ionian Greek dialect. Of these 12 communities, none was greater than the city of Miletus, the jewel of Ionia. Miletus was an ancient city, occupied since the earliest days of the Greeks. It had been destroyed during the Bronze Age collapse, but recolonized by Athenians, and this shared heritage led to a sort of special relationship between the Athenians and the Milesians. Miletus was also home to the great oracle of Apollo at Didyma. Now, we've already seen the importance of oracles to the Greeks and the huge role that they play in the histories of these cities, Athens and Sparta being no exception. But the oracle at Delphi, which is the only one that we've talked about so far, is merely the most famous and the most important of many oracles across the whole Greek world. After Delphi, the most important of these little portals into the future that the Greeks loved was the oracle of Apollo at Didyma, which lay within the territory of Miletus. As a coastal city, Miletus became a thriving maritime power, enjoying the benefits of trade with its many colonies. This was part of a phenomenon called apoikismos, which roughly translates to home away from home, the explosion of Greek colonization, a sudden boom in Greek peoples leaving their homes and taking to the high seas, looking for new lands to settle. Over the course of generations, Greek communities started popping up all over the known world. Some of the largest Greek cities in the entire ancient world were based on the fertile island of Sicily, and southern Italy became home to so many Greeks that the Romans would later refer to the region as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Greek colonies were everywhere during the Archaic and Classical periods, and some of these colonies became so large that they even went to found colonies of their own, and Miletus was no exception to this. Whilst other cities tended to look to the south and west for opportunities, Miletus looked north, to the deep and dark waters of the Euxine Sea, which is what the Greeks called the Black Sea. Cities and Greek communities started popping up around the Black Sea in around the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, tapping into the valuable trade in grain, fish, and slaves, and Miletus was the leader in this effort, founding some of the most prosperous cities on the northernmost reaches of the Greek world. Miletus also flourished as a hub for the intellectual life at the time, and was home to many of the great pre-Socratic philosophers that defined the Greek thinking of the age, the most famous of which is Thales of Miletus, the man credited with designing the city's intricate little grid pattern, and also supposedly being the first Greek to ever predict an eclipse. And, much like Athens, and many of the other Greek cities at the time, Miletus had tyrants, powerful strong men who seized control of the state. The most famous of these Milesian tyrants was a man called Thrasybulus, who held on to power in the city with an iron grip. Herodotus gives us two little anecdotes about this Thrasybulus character that might give us somewhat of an insight into the kind of ruler that he was, or at the very least, the kind of ruler that he was remembered as 2 centuries later. The first of these anecdotes is about his correspondence with a fellow tyrant, a man called Periander. Periander ruled over the prosperous Greek city of Corinth, and he had a lot in common with Thrasybulus. Both of them were tyrants, illegitimate rulers who, no matter how tightly they controlled their cities, lacked the dynastic or constitutional legitimacy of other rulers. Both of them ruled over cities that were great maritime powers, cities that relied on trade and sea power for their influence. And both of them were great colonizing cities. Both Corinth and Miletus had contributed enormously to the growing plethora of Greek communities that dotted the Mediterranean and Black Seas like frogs sitting around a pond. And at one point, Periander sends a messenger to Thrasybulus with a very simple question. What is the best way for a tyrant to rule his city? The best way that will ensure the future security and prosperity of that tyrant and his community? When Periander's messenger arrived in Miletus and presented this question to Thrasybulus, what is the best way to rule a city? The tyrant didn't give the messenger a straight answer. Instead, he decided it was a lovely day to go for a stroll. So he takes the Corinthian messenger with him, and they go for a nice, long, leisurely walk around the countryside of Miletus, through the fields where the farmers are growing wheat. And so Thrasybulus and this messenger are walking up and down and all around the fields of wheat, not unlike a young Theresa May, and the messenger keeps on repeating the question that he has been sent to Miletus to get an answer for. What is the best way to rule a city? And Thrasybulus won't answer the question. Instead, he just strokes his chin and he goes, can you repeat the question, please? And the messenger repeats it over and over again. But this mad tyrant doesn't give him any answer. Instead, he walks up and down the fields throughout the Chora of Miletus, and every time he sees that some of the wheat crop is growing especially large, Thrasybulus goes over to it, he picks the large heads of wheat, and he discards them. And this goes on and on and on, until eventually the Corinthian messenger goes home, with no answer. And when he gets back to Corinth, he is confronted by his very own tyrant, Periander. And Periander asks him, right, what did Thrasybulus say? What is the best way to rule a city? And the messenger just shrugged and said, "I have no idea what you were expecting, but this Thrasybulus of Miletus is clearly a madman. Not only did he not answer my question, no matter how many times I asked it, but as I spent time with him, all he did is walk through his own farms, his own fields. He found the finest crops that his people had grown, and he just destroyed them for no reason. I mean, what kind of a lunatic would destroy his own property like that?" But Periander understood. Both he and Thrasybulus were tyrants, men who ruled over their cities not because they had a right to it, but because they had seized control, because they had risen above the other people of their day and earned it. Now that they were in power, the greatest threat to them was that somebody else might one day do the same. The finest heads of wheat had to be destroyed before they could rise too much higher than the others. As well as doling out lessons on the benefits of a good timely purge, Thrasybulus also fought for the independence of Miletus at a time when the Ionian communities were being increasingly threatened by a new power on their eastern border, the growing kingdom of Lydia. For 11 years, the kingdom of Lydia tried desperately to conquer Miletus by force. Every year, the king of Lydia, Aleates, would march his army into Milesian territory, and the Milesians would retreat behind the high walls of their city. Unable to take Miletus by force, the Lydians would simply destroy the surrounding countryside, burning the crops and the food supplies, hoping that if they did this every year without fail, the Milesians would eventually starve and be forced to sue for peace. But in the 12th year of the war, cunning Thrasybulus saw an opportunity to turn this strategy against the Lydians. During an organised truce in which they were supposed to negotiate, Thrasybulus invited Lydian envoys into the city of Miletus, and when he did this, he decided to open up the city's food reserves, all the stuff that they had stored. These stores were thoroughly depleted by 11 years of war, but despite this, Thrasybulus encouraged his people to feast, to get drunk and to throw festivities. So when the Lydians, who had been under the impression that they were effectively starving Miletus, came into the city and saw people gorging themselves on apparently plentiful supplies, they became disheartened, and in the following negotiations, a peace was agreed in which Miletus was able to keep its independence. But alas, this independence would not last long. We don't know how Miletus fell, but we do know that at some point during the reign of King Croesus of Lydia, Miletus, along with all of the other Ionian communities in West Asia, had been incorporated into the Lydian Empire. But not for long. The Milesians would soon get an opportunity for revenge against the Persians. In the year 540 BCE, King Cyrus of the newly emerging Persian Empire defeated Croesus and conquered his lands, and in doing so, he incorporated into his own empire all of the Ionian communities that had previously been controlled by the Lydians. And these communities sent messages to their new overlord, King Cyrus, asking for favourable terms. But Cyrus told them, "It's too late to ask for that now. At the beginning of this war, I asked you to abandon Croesus, to rebel against your Lydian masters and ally yourself to me, and you all refused. So entirely too late to come crawling to me now looking for friendship." As a result, the Persians did not give the Ionians the favourable terms that they had wanted. Not at all. With the exception of Miletus, Miletus was able to make a separate and far better deal with their new Persian masters, which suggests that A, possibly the Milesians just had some really, really good diplomats, or B, they had been the only Greek city to lend the Persians some support. Fast forward to the year 513 BCE, and Miletus is still firmly under the control of the Persian Empire, and it's ruled by a tyrant called Histiaeus. Histiaeus is one of many Greek tyrants who rule on behalf of the great king of Persia. The Persians loved using tyrants to rule over their Greek communities, for a very good reason. I don't know if you've noticed in this video so far, or in Greek history, but in this era, the Greeks are a politically chaotic bunch. Allegiances are constantly shifting. Factions rise and fall regularly and tear cities apart, and aristocrats love nothing more than infighting amongst one another. The reason that Sparta is undisputably the most powerful Greek city in this period is that it's sort of the exception to this rule. Despite the fact that they've got plenty of politicking and infighting within their own city, their constitution, which was given to them by this mythological demigod figure Lycurgus, remained unchanged, and this gave them stability and a sense of political continuity. And this kind of political chaos, so typical of the Greek cities of this era, was deeply unappealing to the Persians, who for the most part wanted their people to live in peace and stability so that they could keep on reliably paying taxes and so they didn't get any silly ideas about independence. This is a difficult thing to do with, let's say, monarchies, long-lived and long-established dynasties that inspire ancient loyalty and perhaps remind people of a better bygone age. Even harder to do in democracies, where the will of the regular people is ever shifting, and this leads to unpredictable states. No, thought the Persians, we don't want anything to do with that. We prefer our Greek cities to be ruled by local strongmen, preferably ones that we have set up as puppets. These guys are nice and predictable, and even better if they're deeply unpopular amongst their own people and rely on their Persian masters for all of their power. That makes them far less likely to rebel. Or at least, that's the theory. In the year 513 BCE, the tyrant of Miletus was this Histiaeus guy, who was expected to rule over his city on the Persians' behalf. And, in times of war and need, he was expected to provide the Persian Empire with men, money, and support. So when King Darius, the great ruler of the whole Persian Empire, decided to invade the land of Scythia, he brought the Ionians, including Histiaeus, with him. Now, to get to Scythia, which is in modern-day Ukraine and South Russia, the Persians would have to march across the Hellespont, through Europe, and cross the Danube River, which is the largest river in Europe. A tricky thing to do. So, Darius and the Persians decided to do it with the aid of an enormous bridge, a spectacular engineering feat. The Persians built a massive temporary bridge across the Danube so that they could cross into Scythian lands. But this came with a problem. Darius was ever paranoid that as he advanced into Scythia, he would get further and further from his line of escape. He knew that the people he was going to face were nomads, highly mobile warriors who could travel very quickly across their own homeland, and he was ever paranoid that the enemy might outflank him, destroy the bridge, and cut off his lines of supply and retreat. So he tasked Histiaeus and the Ionian Greeks with guarding the great bridge across the Danube and preventing it from falling into enemy hands. So the various Greek communities under Persian rule were given the task of guarding this bridge, and they did it dutifully as their overlord, the King of Kings, marched off into Scythia to go and conquer. But then, wouldn't you know it, the great king's worst nightmare did in fact come true. The enemy outflanked him, rode behind his army, and attempted to cut him off. According to Herodotus, these Scythian nomads came across the bridge and the Ionians who were guarding it, and they implored the Greeks to let them burn the bridge down. They appealed to the Ionians' sense of independence, saying, hey, if you let us do this, our army will completely cut the King of Kings off. We'll have him surrounded, and we will destroy his army and probably kill him. If we do that, it follows that the Persian Empire itself will probably collapse, or at the very least it will be greatly weakened, and you will be free once again from the yoke of Persian power. Many Greeks gave this very serious consideration. One of the leaders amongst the pro-bridge burning faction was a guy called Miltiades, son of Cimon, of the Philaeid clan. You guys remember the Phileids, right? They were from all the way back in chapter 1. They were that noble Athenian family that was chafing under the rule of the Pisistratids and decided to go off into self-imposed exile. And they ended up carving out a little kingdom for themselves in the north of Greece in a place called the Chersonese. Well, this Miltiades, son of Cimon, who is now guarding a bridge over the Danube, is the nephew of that Miltiades we talked about back in chapter 1. I know this is a lot of Greek names to throw your way, but that's why it's such a long video. And this Miltiades, like his uncle, also rules over a little kingdom in the Chersonese. And he is a determined anti-Persian who opposes the rule of the great king at basically all costs. So he advocates that they burn the bridge. But Histiaeus, the tyrant of Miletus, absolutely opposes this. He says they should continue to loyally guard the bridge. He points out that most of his fellow Ionians, his fellow Greeks who were there, are tyrants, strongmen, who were propped up by the Persians, raised to power on behalf of the empire. They are only there because of the Persians, and it would be the worst betrayal for them to turn on their masters now. On top of that, he reminds many of his fellow Ionians, we are deeply unpopular with our fellow countrymen. Our own cities don't really like us. We are only really powerful because we have the backing of the Persian king, and if we turn on him now, we might find ourselves deposed by more popular men, or even worse, by a revolution and maybe a democratic system. And that is how Histiaeus convinced his fellow Ionians to remain loyal to Persia. Herodotus tells us that the Scythians were furious, and even in his day, over a century later, Scythians are known to slur the Ionians as being a servile and slave-like people because they refused to turn their back on the Persians at this critical moment. Here's a good example of how the Persians ruled according to Herodotus. In the region of Ionia at this time, the overall Persian commander was a guy called Athenians. Athenians had served King Darius very well and very competently, so he was rewarded with this prestigious position. But the King of Kings also instructed that the back of the ceremonial chair that Athenians would sit in should be decorated with human skin. It was the skin of Athenias' own father, who had been found guilty of corruption and dishonesty, and had been flayed alive as a result. The Persians were always keen to remind their subjects how steep the price of betrayal really was. But those who served Persia well, those who acted loyally in service of the great king and brought benefits to the empire, they could expect to be rewarded. And the two most impressive and loyal Ionians, as far as Darius was concerned, were Histiaeus of Miletus, who we already know, and a guy called Coes of Mytilene, and both of them were richly rewarded. Coes, who was a common-born man, was given absolute overlordship over his home city of Mytilene, and Histiaeus was given the small territory of Myrcinus in Thrace. Now this might not seem like much, but Myrcinus had great potential. If Histiaeus could mobilize a couple of colonists and invest in a little bit of city building, he would very soon have access to the abundant silver mines and the quality timber that the region produced. But despite the fact that Histiaeus had so far acted with nothing but loyalty towards them, that doesn't mean that the Persians weren't going to keep an eye on him. Persian agents noticed as Histiaeus fortified his new lands, as he recruited soldiers to protect his new possessions, and as he grew richer and richer off the money he made there. And they grew suspicious. And these Persian agents went back to King Darius with a warning. Sure, Histiaeus seems loyal for now, but how much of that loyalty is genuine? Does he really love being a subject to the Persian Empire, or does he just need us for now to maintain his own power at home? And how long do you think he'll need us for if he just keeps growing richer and more powerful? How long do you think it'll be before Histiaeus sees Persian rule as more of a hindrance than it is a help? King Darius took this warning seriously, so he summoned Histiaeus and he said to him, "Look, I've come to realise that I cannot rule without men like you around me, intelligent, sensible, and loyal advisors. So that being said, I'd like you to leave your homeland and accompany me back to the capital of Susa, all the way in far-off Iran, where you can be a permanent voice in my ear." Histiaeus could not refuse this offer, an offer from the great king himself to become his personal advisor. He couldn't get away with saying no to that. And Darius had, in one brilliant political move, removed Histiaeus from his base of power and took him far, far away, all the way to the heart of the Persian Empire, where he could keep an eye on him. As the old saying goes, keep your friends close and your potential enemies even closer. Now, whatever Histiaeus' original intentions were, he was now stuck, deep in Persian territory, surrounded by the king's men, hundreds of miles from home. And this is a little bit of a theme, a little bit of a trope in Herodotus. He tells us several stories of Greeks who at some point get in the good books of the king of Persia and are taken back to Iran because the king just likes having Greeks around. And whether they like him back or not, they are always desperate to get home and have to come up with increasingly convoluted and weird ways of doing so. Histiaeus is now one of these many honoured Greek expats who is constantly plotting his return home. We'll return to Histiaeus and his life in exile fairly soon, but for now let's get back to the city of Miletus, which was being ruled by Histiaeus' cousin / son-in-law, try not to think too hard about that, a guy called Aristagoras. So this Aristagoras figure was ruling Miletus in Histiaeus' name, and it's whilst he's in charge that he's approached by a group of wealthy exiles. These exiles come from the island of Naxos, which is the wealthiest island in the Aegean Sea, and strategically placed right in the middle of it. And these exiles say that they have been driven from their homes by the common people who rose up against them. Evidently, the people of Naxos, not unlike the demos in Athens, grew tired of their bickering aristocrats and have overthrown them. Now these Naxian exiles come to Miletus, looking for aid in returning home. Aristagoras sensed opportunity. He was pretty sure that if he could help these Naxian exiles return and reclaim their island, they might thank him by making him their new ruler, and then he would be in charge of Naxos. Not a bad prize at all. His very own island. Lots of riches, a great big fleet for him to play with. Sounds lovely, actually. Aristagoras would love that. But despite all of the political chaos that had shook the island, Naxos was still strong, heavily fortified, and protected by 8,000 heavily armed hoplite warriors. Aristagoras was not sure at all that he could take the island by force alone. Aristagoras held a lot of sway with the Persian satrap of Sardis, a guy called Artaphernes, who was the brother of the great King Darius. With such powerful connections, Aristagoras thought that he could harness a fair few Persian resources to help with his expedition. And Aristagoras, who is a phenomenal salesman, fully seduces the Persian satrap with his promises. He talks about the great wealth of Naxos, about its strategic importance in the Aegean, and the potential for further conquests in Greece should the expedition go well. Artaphernes is so excited by the prospect of conquest that he not only agrees to Aristagoras' request for 100 ships, he adds another 100 on top of that, promising a great Persian armada of 200 ships to help take Naxos. And so the great fleet set sail. The odds were very much in their favour. They had the numbers on their side. They had insider intelligence from the Naxian exiles, and they had the element of surprise. The Naxians had no idea that the Milesians and the Persians were coming for them. But then it all went spectacularly wrong, thanks to a problem that is so common in coalition warfare. Who is really in charge? That's a question that coalitions often like to avoid asking, because the answer can be quite difficult. You know, you get a group of friends and allies together, you have a common enemy, someone you all want to take down, everyone's getting along, making plans for battle, patting each other on the back, yeah, we're ready for the fight. And then someone brings up the awkward topic of which one of them ought to be the leader. And then before you know it, all of these would-be allies are at each other's throats over which one of them is most deserving of this honour. And this problem lay at the heart of why this joint Persian-Milesian expedition ultimately failed. The Persians were the overlords here. They were the great big empire, of which Miletus was merely a tiny, tiny part that barely showed up on the map. They were the guys that had provided the ships, the money and most of the manpower. Not to mention the Persian contingent was led by the king's own cousin, a guy called Megabates. So obviously the Persians thought that they ought to be in charge. But this whole operation had been Aristagoras' idea. He had conceived of it, he had planned it, and now he was the one executing it. Not to mention, as we will see over the course of the rest of this story, the Greeks are a pretty independently minded people who typically don't play well with others. Aristagoras, as far as he was concerned, was the guy in charge. The Persians were merely here to lend support, and maybe a little bit of cash when needed. But this was his expedition. This problem came to a head when Megabates, the Persian commander, who obviously considered himself to be the supreme commander of the whole expedition, took it upon himself to inspect the Greek ships. And when he found that some of those Greek ships had not been stationing guards properly, as was protocol, he demanded to know who was responsible. And it turns out that the Greek commander who was responsible for this lax discipline and not posting guards near ships was a guy called Scylax. And Scylax was a close personal friend of Aristagoras. But this did not dissuade the Persian commander. He decided that this insolent Greek needed punishing, so he beat him and shoved him through an ore hole. Aristagoras was obviously furious when he found out about this whole episode, and he freed his friend and then began berating the Persian commander. And remember here that Megabates, the leader of the Persians, is the cousin of the great King Darius. Members of the Persian royal family are not used to being spoken down to. But here was Aristagoras publicly dressing him down, berating him, telling him not to overstep his authority and to mind his own business when it came to the Greeks. The Persian commander was livid, and in his anger, he sabotaged the entire operation. He sent word ahead to Naxos, warning them of the coming war. So when Aristagoras and the fleet arrived, expecting to take the Naxians by surprise, they were faced with an island fortress. The locals had stripped the fields bare. The population had been armed, and the city had been fortified. Aristagoras, the Milesians, and the Persians were faced with an island that could not be taken by force and was prepared for a long siege. But Aristagoras had made big promises. He had spent vast sums of borrowed money, and he had come all of this way. He had to at least try. So for 4 months, he and his fleet blockaded Naxos, laying it under siege, surrounding it, and probing for weaknesses. But they didn't find any weaknesses. All they found was further evidence that the coming war would be long and bloody, and that they weren't likely to win it. So Aristagoras was forced to return home to Miletus completely empty-handed, probably in a less than stellar mood. His own people hated him, and he had never been popular to begin with, but this defeat had seriously damaged his reputation. He owed vast sums of money to the Persian satrap Artaphernes, money that he could not pay back. And he likely knew that his failure to capture Naxos and his very public quarrel with the king's own cousin had damaged his standing amongst the Persians. He likely could not rely on their support in the future. All in all, it looked like Aristagoras' days as the ruler of Miletus were numbered. But then, a sudden twist of fate. A messenger arrived in Miletus. He said he had come all the way from the Persian capital at Susa. He was a familiar face as well. The man had been a slave of the previous tyrant of Miletus, Histiaeus, who, if you guys remember, is all the way in Iran as an advisor to King Darius. And this slave came with a request. He asked Aristagoras to shave his head. Weird request, but okay. And as the man's hair was cut away, it revealed a message that had been tattooed to the top of his head. It was from Histiaeus, all the way in Iran, urging Aristagoras to raise Miletus in revolt against the Persians. Histiaeus had smuggled this message under his own slave's hair, hoping that a revolt back home in Ionia might finally convince the great king to send him back. Aristagoras likely felt that he didn't have a lot of choice, so he raised Miletus in rebellion. He threw off the yoke of Persian control, and he declared that the city from here on out would be independent. And across Ionia, this trend caught on. All across the west coast of Asia, Greek cities deposed their pro-Persian rulers, the tyrants who had been propped up by the great king, killing them or driving them into exile. Aristagoras himself graciously stepped down as tyrant of Miletus, possibly to show solidarity with this new sense of equality, this movement that was sweeping the Ionian cities, or possibly because he was deeply unpopular and he chose to jump before someone pushed him. As the Ionian cities prepared to fight the Persians, Aristagoras himself took a ship to mainland Greece to look for allies in his new war. The first place that Aristagoras goes to looking for allies is the most obvious. Sparta was the largest and most militarily powerful state in all of Greece, and it was ruled by the famously interventionalist king Cleomenes. You know, that guy who we spoke about in the last chapter. And Aristagoras laid on all of the charm and salesmanship he had. He described the Spartans as the champions, the liberators of Greece. He described the riches of the Persian Empire and how easily these riches will be acquired. After all, the Persians wear trousers, you know, like women do. How could it possibly be that such an effeminate people would ever be able to stand up against the greatest warriors in all of Greece? Aristagoras then produces a large bronze map of the known world, showing the entire Persian Empire, and he describes its riches, its wealth, and the glory that Sparta will acquire if they can take this juggernaut down. But then, Aristagoras forgets the number one rule of being a crooked salesman. Never tell the customer the truth until the contract has been signed. Cleomenes, who seemed incredibly interested in this enterprise, asks Aristagoras, how long does it take to travel from Sparta to the Persian capital at Susa? How long is the journey? And Aristagoras answers honestly. He tells the truth. He says it takes 3 months. He then begins to describe the route, you know, places to stop and stay, good places to resupply, etc. But Cleomenes cuts him off. He says, the Spartans have no interest in this enterprise, and you have until the end of the day to leave our city. Now, it's not that Cleomenes didn't love a good foreign expedition. He definitely did. But, like most Spartans, he was reluctant to go too far from home. I mentioned in the previous chapter that, according to Herodotus, the massive underclass of enslaved people, the Helots in Sparta, outnumbered the Spartan citizens by a factor of 7 to 1. And the Spartans were fully aware that the only thing that kept this underclass in line was their fear of brutal Spartan reprisals, and the knowledge that even all of them combined and united probably couldn't take on the whole Spartan citizenry. But despite this deterrent and the odds being stacked against them, the Helots had revolted in the past, and they would do again in the future. This was something that the Spartans were constantly paranoid about. If Cleomenes decided to take the majority of armed Spartans away from home for months on end to fight a dangerous war hundreds of miles away, how long do you think it would take for the enslaved Helots to realise the opportunity that this presented them? Cleomenes might successfully liberate Ionia, but he risked losing Sparta. But Aristogoras did not give up. He followed Cleomenes home, making increasingly extravagant promises if he would just send aid to Miletus. Eventually, the promises get so extreme that King Cleomenes is forced to stop and consider them. That is, until his 9-year-old daughter intervened. Gorgo, the king's daughter, grabbed his hand and said, "Father, father, this man will corrupt you." Cleomenes, pleased with his young daughter's wisdom, recognized that she had the truth of it. He went into his house, locked the door behind him, and left Aristogoras standing alone in the street. So, the Spartans, the most powerful state in Greece, had answered this call to be the liberators of Ionia, the great warriors who would go and relieve them of the yoke of Persian oppression, with a resounding no. What now? Well, obviously Aristogoras had to try the second most powerful state in Greece, the newly democratic Athenians. Aristogoras goes to Athens, and he stands before the ecclesia, before the citizenry of the city, and he makes the exact same argument that he had made to Cleomenes. You guys will be the liberators of Greece. The Persians are rich, but weak, etc. But this time, it works. The Athenians, who, as I've already mentioned, feel this sense of kinship with the Milesians, are dead keen to set sail and fight some Persians. Herodotus fairly cynically comments that this is proof that it is easier to fool a crowd than it is to fool an individual. This is an odd comment to make. It sounds a little bit like Herodotus is parroting a common criticism levelled at Athenian democracy at the time, that the demos, the regular people, were stupid, gullible, easy to manipulate. But this is a little unusual because elsewhere in his narrative, Herodotus praises democracy as a system that makes states stronger, and he praises the Athenians as being the wisest of the Greeks. I think that this is a nice reminder that Herodotus himself probably had fairly complicated views about the Greek politics of his day. He probably saw things in fairly nuanced terms, beyond just democracy good or democracy bad, or oligarchy good or oligarchy bad. You know, he was a complicated and intelligent man. He probably had lots of thoughts on this kind of stuff. And those thoughts would have affected his worldview, the worldview through which we get the version of events of what happened back then. And Herodotus, at this point in Greek history, is our only version of events. Look, I'm getting very, very sidetracked by all of this, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here. So if you're interested in Herodotus and democratic ideology and how the two intertwine, there's a little article down below in the you-know-what. Anyways, back to the regular story. The Athenians agree to send help to Miletus, and they agree to send 20 ships eastwards to take part in the war. Herodotus, with the enormous power of hindsight, said that this moment proved to be the beginning of great misfortune for both Greeks and non-Greeks. And so the great Greek coalition comes together, thousands of warriors ready to fight the Persians, and they move at lightning speed. They march so quickly that they outpace news of their own rebellion, reaching the capital of Persian power in the region, the city of Sardis, before the Persians even knew they were coming. The Persian satrap Artaphernes, the brother to the great King Darius himself, found himself in an impossible situation. His city was being stormed by rebellious Greeks. He was surrounded on the Acropolis with only a small group of bodyguards. Sardis was becoming engulfed in flames as fires spread, and there was no sign of the Persian army. Seeing that the situation was completely lost, Artaphernes ordered his small force of household soldiers and his few bodyguards to advance. Now, there was no hope of victory here. The Persians were outnumbered by an enormous amount, and they were completely surrounded. But this wasn't about victory. Artaphernes would not have it said that he simply sat in his palace and waited for the flames to engulf him. He was a Persian, and he was a member of the Achaemenid ruling clan, and the Persians were a warrior people. He wanted to die fighting. Artaphernes marched his guard into the town square of Sardis, looking to make a final stand. But the Greeks, who were already kind of annoyed that this fire they'd accidentally started was getting in the way of their looting, simply ran away. Why did they need to fight a couple of Persian guardsmen and nobles? There was no point in that. They had already burned Sardis down. As far as they were concerned, mission completed. And then, most of the Greeks just go home. The Athenians, for one, decide that their part in the war is over, they've got nothing else to do, and they go back to Athens. And most other Greek communities do the same thing. This is going to be a bit of a theme in the coming war. Greek disunity. The incapability of these many small communities to work in concert with each other. As far as most of the Greeks were concerned, the job was over. Sardis was burned, Ionia was free. It was time to go back to business as usual. And business as usual for the Greeks is fighting with each other, not teaming up to fight Persians. But of course, the Persians weren't actually defeated. Herodotus says that the Ionians had done enough damage to be taken seriously by the empire, but not nearly enough to dissuade them from coming back and fighting more. Artaphernes, the governor of Sardis, had unexpectedly survived the sack of his city and was busy rallying loyalists across Asia Minor. And back in Susa, the great King Darius had received news of this revolt, and he had sworn bloody vengeance. Persian retaliation was swift and brutal. The island of Cyprus, which had joined in with the rebellion, was very quickly repacified by Persian forces, and the kingdom of Caria, a little spot of land just at the south of Asia Minor, which happened to be the homeland of our writer Herodotus, was also very quickly subdued and brought back under Persian control. The Hellespont, the strategically vital passage to the Black Sea that lay to the north of the Ionian cities, was assaulted and captured by the Persians, and one by one the rebellious cities were brought back into the fold. Those who were leaders in the rebellion were executed, populations were enslaved, and certain towns were simply flattened. Soon enough, Artaphernes, the Persian satrap, and Atarnes, the Persian commander, started bearing down on Miletus itself, the heart of the rebellion, the jewel of Ionia where this whole mess had started. And they came down on it with an enormous land army and a mighty armada of 600 ships. Seeing this, Aristogoras, the guy whose idea this whole revolt had been, completely lost heart, and he fled. Aristogoras, the mastermind behind the Ionian Revolt, died somewhat anticlimactically. He went to Thrace, where his family had some lands that had been gifted to them by King Darius as a result of their loyal service, which is ironic, isn't it? Anyways, maybe he hoped to use the local silver mines to fund his comeback, or perhaps he intended to build a new fleet, one that might match the Persians. We'll never know, because Aristogoras was killed by some local Thracians in a fairly unimportant skirmish just outside of town. And that was the end of him. Histiaeus didn't fare much better. You guys remember him, right? He was the original tyrant of Miletus, the guy who had started this whole mess by tattooing the idea of a rebellion to the head of his slave. Well, Histiaeus had convinced King Darius that he was the only man qualified to bring an end to this rebellion, and the gullible king agreed to send him back to Greece. Histiaeus seems to have been under the impression that he could rally the Ionians to his cause. But he had been away from home for a long time at this point, and his popularity had waned somewhat. Not to mention, he had been perfectly good at tricking King Darius. The great king was up for believing anything that Histiaeus told him. But Darius's brother, the satrap Artaphernes, was not so easily fooled. The Persian satrap knew that Histiaeus could not be trusted, and soon enough the would-be tyrant of Miletus found himself without friends on either side of this war. Histiaeus seems to have spent a little while messing around in the north of Greece, being a pirate around the Hellespont, something like that. But this doesn't last long. Pretty soon, Artaphernes, the Persian satrap, captures him. Now, Herodotus tells us that if Histiaeus had been allowed to return to Susa, if he had been sent back to King Darius, to the Persian capital and the palace, he would have explained himself and the great king would have no doubt forgiven him. Darius was clearly very fond of his little pet Greek. But Artaphernes knew this and he didn't want to take the chance, so he impaled Histiaeus as soon as he got his hands on him, and then he sent his severed head back to his brother Darius. King Darius was obviously furious that his favourite Greek had been killed this way, but it didn't matter. It was too late. Histiaeus was gone, and the Ionian Revolt was effectively leaderless. With the Persians breathing down their necks, the remaining Ionian rebels met for a great conference at the Pan-Ionium. Now, I've mentioned before that the 12 communities of Ionia, the 12 Ionian cities, were a quarrelsome and divided bunch, but they were united by a loose feeling of shared heritage and shared culture. The Pan-Ionium was one of those few shared things that brought these 12 cities together. Despite all of their bickering and their feuds and their infighting, the Ionian cities would gather at the Pan-Ionium for religious festivals, ceremonies, and games. And when they did, that was the closest that the Ionians ever came to being one united people. It had previously been suggested that the Ionian cities should unite more formally. Herodotus tells us that Thales of Miletus once used the Pan-Ionium as a venue to suggest that all of the Ionian communities confederate and be governed as one state. That way they would be stronger and more easily able to resist outsiders. But this proposal was rejected. It was offensive to the Greek ideals of eleutheria and autonomy, freedom and independence. Even with a common foe like the Persians to unite the Ionians, Greeks were always very suspicious even of one another. So this Pan-Ionium met, and they decided that their best odds when it came to beating the Persians was to meet them not on land, but at sea. Each one of the cities swore to provide as many warships as possible until a great fleet of 353 Greek triremes was formed. A trireme, by the way, is the word for a Greek warship, or a type of Greek warship. It had 3 rows of oars and relied on speed and ramming as a weapon. They would use those vicious rams you can see at the front to try and break enemy ships in two. And then one of the Ionian leaders, a man called Dionysus of Phakia, stepped forward and he made a speech. He reminded the Ionians of the peril that now faced them. Even though the Greeks were great sailors, the Persian fleet that they would be facing was not only larger, but it was led by Phoenicians. And Phoenicians were famed the world over as the best sailors on earth. Dionysus tells the Greeks that this will be hard, but if they accept hardship in the short term, they might avoid Persian slavery in the long term. They would need to train, they would need to practice, and they would need to learn how to fight as one. Dionysus instituted a brutal training regiment to get the Ionians up to scratch, ready to face the larger Persian navy. But here's where the disunity of the Ionians and the Greeks more generally really worked against them. Dionysus was a little bit of a nobody. He had only provided 3 ships of his own to the massive Greek armada of 353. And besides, he was from Phakia, one of the smallest and most insignificant of the Ionian cities. Who is this guy, the other Ionians all thought, to tell us what to do? Who is this guy to work us until our muscles ache? Who is this guy to order us around, pretending like he knows best? I mean, he's warning about Persian slavery in the future, but he's acting like he's our master now. No thank you, said the Ionians. We're not having it. If Dionysus of Phakia wants to fight the Persians his way, he is welcome to, but leave us out of it. And the Persians take great advantage of all of this infighting. Across Ionia, cities and individuals start making deals with the Persian Empire. All can be forgiven, says the King of Kings. This rebellion is obviously doomed. Do you really want to stand and die alongside these other Greeks, many of which you don't like anyways? Or would you rather make a deal with us before it's too late and avoid the horrible fate that is surely in store for all of them? And then, finally, in the year 494 BCE, 5 years after the rebellion had begun, the final decisive battle for Ionian independence took place just off the island of Lade. 353 Greek vessels faced down against 600 Persian ones, and almost immediately Greek hopes fell apart. The ruler of the island of Samos, which was one of the largest and most important Ionian communities at this critical moment, showed his true colours. He had been one of those Greeks who had accepted the great king's deal, and just before battle was joined, he turned his ships around and sailed home. Seeing him do this, many of the Greek sailors from the island of Lesbos did the exact same thing. The battle hadn't even started yet, no fighting had begun, but already the Greek line was disintegrating. Of the 60 ships that made up the Samian contingent of this allied force, only 11 of them refused the orders to turn tail. Instead, these 11 ships decided to go out fighting, rather than accept the ignominy of having betrayed the allied cause. Herodotus tells us that many decades later, when he's writing, the Samians, who likely consider this a shameful chapter in their history, honour the sailors of these 11 ships as heroes, and they are given the rare honour of having all of their names inscribed on a column in the city centre of Samos. Herodotus also tells us that the Chians, Greek sailors from the island of Chios, who had provided the largest number of ships, a full 100 vessels, also chose to stay and fight. Herodotus tells us that the Chians fought more bravely than any other Greeks did that day, but that they also suffered the worst losses. The Chians aggressively attacked the Persian lines. Herodotus says they did this using a tactic called the diekplus maneuver, which roughly translates to going in and out. Modern scholars aren't 100% sure what this means, but it seems to have been a fairly effective naval tactic, because the Chians inflicted very heavy losses on the Persians. Unfortunately, they also suffered heavy losses themselves, and eventually they were forced to withdraw. Sadly, the Chians didn't get a happy ending. They were forced to flee north, where eventually they had to beach their ships at the mouth of the river Macali, near the Greek city of Ephesus. They likely planned to continue their flight overland, but unfortunately, the local Ephesians mistook this band of refugees for pirates. They fell on them on the beach and massacred the Chian survivors. Such was the fate of the Chians. Dionysos, the man who had tried and failed to prepare the Ionians for battle, made a good showing for himself. He captured 3 enemy ships. But eventually, he realized the battle was lost, and he abandoned the Ionian cause. Dionysos sailed to the Levant, where he became a very wealthy pirate, eventually settling on the island of Sicily, where he continued to raid Phoenician and Persian shipping. Herodotus notes that he became a very famous pirate, not only for his success and his riches, but also because he was known to attack the Persians and Phoenicians, but never would he attack other Greek ships. With the backbone of the resistance broken, the Persians set about wreaking bloody revenge on the Greeks, sailing from island to island and city to city. Herodotus describes the Persian practice of trawling Greek islands, where they would land vast numbers of Persian soldiers who would then all link arms and walk across the entire island, checking every corner, every nook and cranny, to make sure that not a single person escaped them. When everyone had been rounded up, the Persians treated these communities according to their conduct during the war. So, for example, when the Persians went to the island of Samos, they treated the people very gently, because the Samians had made a deal with the Persian king and abandoned the rebellion before the climactic battle was met. However, when the Persians landed on Chios, they revealed the full extent of their cruelty and brutality against this particular city that had fought so hard and so bitterly. In Chios, all of the military-aged men were put to death. all of the women and children were sent back to Persia as slaves, and all of the young boys were castrated. When Miletus itself finally fell, the Persians didn't hold back on this city either. Most of the men were killed, and anyone who remained was sold into slavery. The city was leveled. The Oracle of Apollo at Didyma, one of the most sacred sites in the whole Greek world, was burnt to the ground, and any survivors were forcibly displaced and resettled in Mesopotamia. Miletus, the jewel of Ionia and the heart of the revolt, was less than a shadow of what it had once been. The Athenians especially mourned this catastrophe. The Milesians and the Athenians had something of a special relationship. They were very, very close states. After all, Miletus had been settled by Athenian colonists generations previously. So the Athenians and the Milesians considered themselves to be like kin, to be like distant family members. The sack of Miletus was therefore so profoundly impactful on the Athenian psyche that when an Athenian playwright produced The Fall of Miletus, a theatrical version of the events of the war, that playwright was fined 1,000 drachmae and the play itself was banned. The reason for this being that when it was performed, the audience had wept so hard that the state felt the need to ban it for the good of its own people. The Athenians seem to have been pretty keen to put this whole sorry episode behind them. The sack of Miletus, the Ionian Revolt, and their role in it had been a disaster, and there was no use dwelling on it. But the Persians remembered. The Persians made sure that they remembered. Herodotus tells us that when King Darius was brought news of the burning of Sardis, he dismissed the Ionian rebels, knowing that he would inevitably reconquer them in time. But he asked who these Athenians were, and when somebody told him about this small Greek city-state to the west of his empire, he asked for his bow, and he took an arrow and shot it high into the air, swearing an oath by the gods that he would one day revenge himself on the Athenians. From there on out, the great King Darius employed a servant to interrupt his dinner. Anytime he sat down to eat, his meal would be interrupted 3 times by this servant who would whisper in his ear, "Sire, remember the Athenians." I mean, probably not though, right? Like, probably not really. That's probably not really what actually happened. Sorry, Herodotus, but this is one of those anecdotes of yours that just feels very made up for dramatic effect. It's a nice little story, a nice little bit, you know, there's a lot of drama there. The Persian king sitting in his palace, getting all angry and obsessed with the Athenians, even if it does reek of Greek self-importance. I bet the 5th century Athenians went nuts for this bit of Herodotus. Anytime it was read out, I bet they all cheered and went, yeah, the king of Persia probably is obsessed with us and really angry with us. But it's probably not true. The king of Persia probably had better things to do than sit around thinking about Athenians all day. Sorry, Herodotus, I love you, but I just don't buy it. Anyways, fade back out. That's the real end of the chapter now. We got a whole other war that we've got to get to before this video's over, and we don't have time for all of this analysis. Miletus was in ruins. The Ionian forces had been destroyed, and the leaders of the Ionian revolt were either dead or in exile. Persian dominance over West Asia had not only been resecured, it had been expanded. In the aftermath of the revolt, the Persians began exercising even more control over their western territories. Cities that had taken part in the rebellion found themselves being brutally suppressed, as did cities that had played absolutely no role whatsoever. Poor little Thasos, for example, a small but wealthy island in the northern Aegean, found itself attacked, invaded, and occupied by Persians, despite the fact that it had never done anything to insult the Persian Empire. The message to the Greeks was clear. If you had dared to stand up to the great king, or to spit in the face of Persia, be prepared to find a large army parked outside your walls, ready to dish out the consequences. And if you hadn't insulted Persia, be prepared for that to happen anyway. Miltiades the Phileid, that Athenian aristocrat who had a domain in the north of Greece, could see the writing on the wall. He had been a vocal opponent of Persian rule for years now. He had even tried fomenting his own revolt against the Persians long before Miletus and the Ionians did. He had set himself up as the anti-Persian, the Mede fighter, and now he was the last Mede fighter left. He saw himself very much in the sights of this vengeful empire. Miltiades knew that he would be unable to face the Persians alone, so he didn't even try, he just fled, even though he knew that that would mean abandoning the lands that his family had ruled for generations. Miltiades also likely knew that when he returned to Athens, he would be prosecuted by his fellow countrymen as a result of his conduct as a ruler. These newly democratic Athenians weren't all that keen on arrogant and ambitious aristocrats like himself with tyrannical inclinations. But whatever his fellow countrymen did to him, it would be nothing compared to what the Persians would do if they got their hands on him. So Miltiades decided to flee. Miltiades' escape from the Persians was a close-run thing. Seeing the enemy fleet close in, he loaded all of his possessions and his family onto only 5 ships and set sail. Miltiades and 4 of his ships managed to escape before the Persians could cut them off, but the 5th ship, which carried his eldest son, was captured. Miltiades' son was taken back to Persia as a prisoner and would never be allowed to return home or see his father ever again. Persian dominance had been thoroughly re-established, but honour hadn't been fully satisfied yet. Sure, Ionia lay in ruins, and the leaders of the revolt had all been killed or, like Miltiades, forced to flee. But they weren't the only ones who had insulted the great king. Cities from mainland Greece like Eretria and Athens had provided aid to the Ionian Revolt and even sent some soldiers of their own. Soldiers who had participated in the sacking and burning of Sardis. They couldn't be allowed to get away with it. Supposedly, King Darius was being reminded on a daily basis by his servants that Athens had insulted him and he needed to take revenge. And now, a new advisor joined the great king, one who would provide valuable aid in attacking the Athenians. Hippias, the old tyrant of Athens who had been deposed, was still very much alive and kicking. Well, sort of. He was kind of alive and kicking. He was very old at this point and suffering from some fairly bad health conditions, prone to violent coughing fits. But despite his age and his infirmity, he had never given up on his dream to one day retake power in Athens. And now he was advising the great king of Persia on how best to invade the country. He told King Darius that he ought to attack Athens by sea and land his army on the great plain of Marathon, the exact same place where Hippias and his father Pisistratus had once landed an army of their own when they took the city by force, all those years ago. But how best to do this? How best to punish the Athenians? What is the most effective way of invading mainland Greece at all? This is not as straightforward a question as it may seem. I mean, sure, on the surface level, all of the odds seem completely stacked in the Persians' favour. They are the big empire. They've got the vast resources. They've got the enormous amount of wealth. And they're the ones that can field huge armies and navies, the likes of which the Athenians could never dream of mustering. But that being said, the Greeks were a tricky people, and Greece is a tricky country, as many invaders have found out throughout all of history to their detriment, and as the Persians knew from recent experience. The Persians had made some attempts to spread their influence into Greece before, and it had never gone that well for them. The first of these was a diplomatic mission sent to the north of Greece, with the hopes of bringing the small kingdom of Macedon into the Persian fold. The story that Herodotus tells us goes like this. 7 Persian noblemen arrive at the court of the Macedonian king, and they make a demand for earth and water. Asking for earth and water is something that comes up quite often in Herodotus' narrative, although he is the only ancient source that ever mentions this. and it seems to have been something that the Persians demanded of any new people they met that they looked to one day rule over. It's interpreted as a sign of submission to Persia, symbolic submission. By handing them earth and water, it's like you're handing the land over to them. The Macedonian king accepts, he hands over earth and water, and then he throws a massive feast for the Persian noblemen. And the Persians go into his palace, they very quickly make themselves at home, and they start drinking vast quantities of the king's wine. And as the evening goes on, the Persians start getting drunker, and they turn to the king of Macedon and they say, "Where are all of the women? There's only men in this room." You know, in Persia, it's customary that men and women drink together, but there's only men here. And the Macedonian king explains, he goes, well, here in Macedon, it's customary that men and women eat and drink separately. But he can see that the Persian nobles, they don't really like this response. So he tells them, okay, seeing as you're our guests and our new masters, I will honour the Persian custom and allow the women to come and drink and eat with us. And so the women of the Macedonian household are brought into the room. You know, the king's relatives, wives, daughters, sisters of the Macedonian nobility, etc. But the Persians at this point have gotten incredibly drunk, and they start harassing these women, grabbing at them and groping them, trying to tear their clothes off. The Macedonian king and his nobility are obviously horrified at this sign of disrespect, but there's not really much that they can do about it. But then the king's son and heir, cunning Prince Alexander, steps forward. He can see that his father is upset, and he goes to him and he says, "Dad, go to bed. You don't want to see this. You don't want to watch these Persians take advantage of their position, the fact that they're an empire, to dishonour our women this way. It'll be too much for you. You go upstairs, get some rest. I'll handle everything down here. Don't you worry. I'll deal with the Persians." But the king knows his son, and he can see in his eyes that he is also furious at what's going on. And before he leaves, he reminds him, he says, "Remember, the Persians are dangerous guests. No matter how they treat us, no matter what they do to us, or no matter how they treat our relatives or the women of our household, we must endure it. You've already seen what the Persians do to countries that resist them. Whatever happens, we cannot risk bringing destruction to our own people." Having issued this stern warning, the king went to bed, and wily Prince Alexander was free to set his plan in motion. He stood before the drunk Persian nobleman and he said, "Gentlemen, what an honour it is to have you here, representatives of the great king himself, here in my humble palace. We Macedonians are just thrilled to be part of the Persian Empire, the greatest empire that has ever been. And to show our gratitude, and to acknowledge that you Persians are the masters and we are but humble servants, I have decided to make all of the women of the household available to you for whatever services you might want, if you know what I mean. Gentlemen, simply behold my sisters, my cousins, my female relatives. Choose your favourite, and I will make a gift of them to you." The drunk Persians are delighted to hear this, and they start grabbing at the horrified women. But Prince Alexander stands in their way, says, Gentlemen, calm down. Let's do this properly. Everybody form an orderly queue, pick your favourite, and then go to your room and wait. These women need an opportunity to wash and prepare themselves, and they will join you shortly. So the Persians eagerly go to their rooms to wait, provided with more wine, of course, to keep their senses nice and dull. And whilst they're waiting, Alexander springs his trap. Alexander has the women swap clothes with some of his soldiers, who then conceal daggers and other weapons underneath their skirts and dresses. They then go into the dark rooms where the drunk Persians are waiting and kill all of them. As this was happening, Alexander led the rest of his soldiers in an ambush of the Persian camp. They fell on the unsuspecting Persians and they killed everyone. And I really do mean everyone. Soldiers, cooks, slaves, doesn't matter who. anyone who had come with the Persian mission was massacred. And when the slaughter was over, Alexander burned, buried, and hid all the bodies, all of the baggages, everything that the Persians had brought with them, until there was not a scrap of evidence in Macedon that the Persians had ever even visited. Obviously, someone came looking for them. 7 very important people had disappeared, and King Darius would want to know what had happened to them. The Persians sent a search party, and Prince Alexander watched calmly as they searched every inch of his palace, looking for evidence. But they found nothing. Alexander then offered the leader of this search party a very large gift to, reaffirm his loyalty to the Persian Empire, and to encourage the search party to go back to Darius and report that they had found nothing. The leader of this party, who had in fact found nothing, happily took this bribe and reported that fact to Darius. And that was the end of the first Persian expedition into Greece. The next attempt by the Persians to bring parts of Greece into their empire took place a few years later, just after the Ionian Revolt. The king's own son-in-law, an ambitious but somewhat reckless young warrior called Mardonius, led a combined army and navy across the north coast of Greece, subjugating cities and taking land. However, his expedition lost all steam and all morale once it reached Mount Athos. It was here that the Persian fleet was hit by a sudden and violent storm that wrecked most of their ships and left their sailors bobbing around in the water, where they quickly became prey for the sharks that were known to infest the area. That's right, sharks in the Mediterranean. You don't really hear about that much, but they do exist out there, just in case you wanted your next holiday to Spain, Italy, or Greece to be a little bit more anxiety-filled, as mine will now be. And not long after this disaster, where the fleet is almost entirely wrecked, a tribe of local Thracians fell on the Persian camp in an ambush. The Persians fought hard, and the battle took place at night time, which really added a level of horror to things. But the Persians did eventually win. However, many of them had been killed, and Mardonius himself had been wounded. Mardonius stayed in the region just long enough to wipe out the tribe that had attacked him. But his fleet had been destroyed, and his army was thoroughly demoralized. Embarrassed by the whole affair, he was forced to return home. So bearing all of this in mind, King Darius wanted to attack Athens, and possibly conquer even more of Greece. But these recent failures had made him cautious. He would have to think very hard about how best to do this. To start with, Mardonius was stripped of his command. Sure, he was the king's own son-in-law, and clearly a favourite, but his recent failures in the north of Greece and his reputation for impetuousness proved that he was not the right guy for this mission. Instead, command of the entire expedition was given to an experienced man called Datis the Mede, who was joined by Artaphernes the Younger, the son of Artaphernes the Elder, who was the king's own brother and satrap of Ionia. We know Artaphernes the Elder. He was the one who was in Sardis when it was sacked, the one who had tried to make that big last stand in the city centre. The Persians also decreed that the newly reconquered Ionians would have to prove their loyalty to Persia by building 600 ships and horse transports to ferry the Persian army across to Athens. Not to mention, after the disaster at Mount Athos, the storm, the shipwrecks, and the shark attacks, the Persians decided to think much more carefully about which route they would take. They decided to sail from Samos and island hop across the Aegean until they reached mainland Greece. This would give the Persians the opportunity to take some smaller prizes and to conscript some locals into their army. The first major island that this Persian armada encountered was Naxos. You might remember that a good few years previously, the Naxians had successfully resisted a combined Persian-Milesian invasion, and it was probably because of this defiance that the Persians chose to take revenge on them now. The Persians fell on Naxos without warning. They burned the town to the ground, and they enslaved anybody that they found. Thankfully for the Naxians, however, there was practically nobody left in the town for the Persians to capture. Yet again, someone had tipped the islanders off that an attack was incoming, the exact same thing that had doomed the first Persian expedition to Naxos. The local population had consequently evacuated their city and gone into the interior of the island where they could more easily hide. The Persians could have spent weeks or even months on Naxos, rooting out all of the resistance, but they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to get bogged down here. Naxos was not their objective. It was merely a small island that they encountered on the way that, needed a quick reminder that you couldn't resist Persia without consequences. So the Persians, who were satisfied with having burnt the better part of the island to the ground, set sail once again. The next island that the Persians encountered was Delos, the sacred island of Apollo that lay directly in the middle of the Aegean Sea. The Delians, when they saw that the Persian fleet was coming for them, evacuated the island, and they all fled to safety in surrounding communities. But Datis the Mede, the commander of the Persians, sent them messages asking them to come back to Delos. He said that they had nothing to fear. The Delians had never spat in the face of the great king. They'd never done anything to insult the Persians, so they had nothing to be worried about. He wasn't there to burn their town and enslave them, he was merely there to honour the god Apollo. Datis then went to the sanctuary of Apollo on Delos, and he burnt a truly enormous amount of incense, as an offering to the Greek deity. Herodotus gives us this neat little insight into the Persian way of ruling, into their carrot and stick approach. If you submitted to Persia, and if you acted like a good little subject, you could expect rewards, and if you resisted or defied Persia, you could expect dire consequences. And this rule even applied to the divine. To the great shock of the Greeks, the Persians had had zero scruples about burning down the sacred oracle of Apollo at Didyma. But this was because the oracle of Apollo at Didyma lay within the territory of Miletus, and Miletus had revolted against Persia. But here was a Persian general making extremely generous offerings to that exact same god, Apollo, on the island of Delos. People, cities, and even gods were treated with either incredible generosity or incredible brutality, dependent entirely on how loyal they were to the Persian king. And so, having appeased the god Apollo, Datis and the Persian army sailed onwards towards Athens. But they didn't go there directly. They had one more stop to make first. The city of Eretria, one of the largest and most important Greek cities on the island of Euboea, had also provided aid to the Ionian Revolt, same as the Athenians had. Datis planned to attack Eretria first, burn it to the ground, and then use it as a base from which he could attack Athens, which lay only just across this narrow sea. When they learned of the Persian intentions, a good many Athenians went to Eretria themselves, where they hoped to provide aid and join a united resistance that may either defeat the Persians or at the very least slow them down. But when the Athenians arrived at Eretria, they found a city divided against itself. Half of the Eritrean citizens wanted to fight the Persians, but the other half wanted to surrender and beg for mercy. United, Eretria may have stood a chance, but divided, there was no hope that the city would resist Datis or the Persian army. Aeschines, one of the Eritrean leaders, encouraged the Athenian volunteers to go home and look to the defense of their own city, for his was surely lost. This prediction proved correct. It only took 6 days for the Persians to take Eretria. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the city fell as a result of treachery. 2 men who belonged to that party that wanted to surrender to Persia and beg for mercy decided to open the gates one night, and Datis and his army poured in. Eretria was burned to the ground, utterly destroyed, and the population was either killed or enslaved. With Eretria defeated, Datis loaded all of his men back onto their ships and started sailing south. He did so on the advice of Hippias, the Pisistratid, the old tyrant of Athens, who had joined the Persian army, hoping to reassume power in Athens once the Persians were done sacking it. And Hippias said that the best place for the Persians to land would be at Marathon, a wide beach where they would be easily able to disembark their whole army, and the flattest part of Athenian territory, where the Persian cavalry would run circles around the Greeks. With the Persians inbound, the Athenians took action. They sent messengers to all of the surrounding Greek communities, hoping that their fellow Greeks would see the danger that they were all in and send help. Particularly important was getting the Spartans on side. The Spartans were, after all, the most powerful state in all of Greece. If anyone could help them beat the Persians, it would be the Spartans. I mean, sure, Sparta and Athens weren't really on the best terms at the time. You know, ever since Cleomenes had marched into Athens to intervene in their politics and gotten himself besieged on the Acropolis. But the Athenians hoped that all of that was in the past now, done and dusted many years ago. And besides, the Spartans were sure to recognize that a Persian invasion was a threat to all of them. The Athenians sent a runner to Sparta, a guy called Phidippides, who ran the approximately 150 miles from Athens to Sparta to beg the Spartans for aid. Which is a wild way of going about this when you really think about it. I mean, the Persians would be there within days. There must have been a real sense of urgency in Athens. Was this really the fastest way to get a message to the Spartans? Just sending some guy, albeit a very fast guy, on foot? I mean, why not send someone on horseback? It's not like the Greeks didn't have horses. We know they did. Regardless of why, Phidippides did run from Athens to Sparta, and he arrived and he made a great speech to the Spartans, imploring them to join the war against Persia. And the Spartans were swayed. They agreed. They would stand beside Athens and fight the Persians, who were surely a threat to all Greek peoples. But they wouldn't do it yet. They wouldn't send help straight away. The Spartans were a deeply religious people, and, as we've already discussed, pretty rigid when it came to observation of their own traditions. The Spartan political constitution, their class system, their whole way of doing things was, according to our ancient sources, based in a strict adherence to Spartan law. Spartan law must be observed no matter what, and according to Spartan law, an army does not march during a religious festival. The Spartans were in the midst of one such religious festival, and it would not end until the full moon came around, which was in about 10 days. Until then, the Athenians were on their own. Phidippides ran all the way back to Athens to deliver this bittersweet response. The Spartans would help the Athenians, but no Spartan would leave home for at least 10 more days. The Persians would arrive first, meaning that the Athenians could not count on Spartan help until it was potentially too late. And this was followed by even worse news for the Athenians. The calls for help that they had sent to their neighbouring cities had come back almost entirely unanswered. Not only would the Spartans be delayed, but it looked like no other Greek cities would come and help the Athenians. Of all of the requests for help that the Athenians had sent to other cities, potentially hundreds of them, only one Greek city had sent a response. The small Boeotian town of Plataea. The Plataeans were a tiny little community of Greeks that lived just to the north of Athens, and for years and years they had been victimized by their much larger and much more powerful neighbor, the city of Thebes. About 30 years before the Persian invasion, in roughly the year 520 BCE, the Thebans had attempted to force the Plataeans to submit to them. But the Plataeans had resisted, and when they did so, the only city that sent aid to them were the Athenians, who helped them fight to retain their independence. 3 decades later, the Plataeans remembered that the Athenians had stood by them in their time of need, and they were keen to repay the favour. They mustered all of the fighting men they could, and all of the arms and armour, and sent them to join the fight against Persia. But like I've already mentioned, Plataea was a very, very small Greek city, and despite their commitment, they could only muster about 1,000 warriors to join the Athenian army. Altogether, this led to approximately 10,000 Greek soldiers ready to fight the Persians, who seemed to have outnumbered the Greeks roughly 3 to 1. And so the Athenian army and its small contingent of Plataean allies marched out of the city to meet the Persians. I say Athenian army, but I think we should clarify exactly what kind of army this was. The Athenians, and the Greeks generally in this period, across the board, had no professional army. There was no such thing as soldiering as a profession at this point in Greek history. Well, that's not technically true. Mercenaries existed, so there was such thing as soldiering as a profession, but no state had a standing army. They would do later in Greek history, but not yet. Professional standing armies are still a long way off. Instead, in times of war, it was the citizens, the regular folk, people with day jobs, who took up arms, put on helmets and picked up spears to fight in defense of their city. Greek armies in this period are effectively just citizen militias who fought seasonally and only when necessary. Defending your state was just considered part of your responsibility as a citizen. And because there was no professional army, there was also no standardized equipment. Greek armies looked incredibly diverse because each soldier equipped himself out of his own pocket. Because of this, the backbone of every Greek army was the wealthy, landed citizenry. People with spare cash to spend on good quality arms and armour who could equip themselves as heavy infantrymen. The standard getup looked like this: helmet, big round shield, spear, and greaves. Add all of that together and you have the hoplite or the hoplite, the standard Greek heavy infantryman. Hoplites came in all shapes and sizes because they equipped themselves. They could have a variety of different looks. For example, very wealthy hoplites might have snazzy breastplates like this one here, with full fake abs and fake nipples and everything, whilst hoplites with slightly less money might have lighter, cheaper armour. But as long as they've got the big round shield, the spear, the helmet and the greaves, they were a hoplite. These citizen soldiers, these hoplites, would advance into battle in a great mass called a phalanx, a great wall of shields and armour and men and muscle, bristling with spears like a massive moving hedgehog. And the phalanx, as long as it stayed together, would present a fearsome obstacle towards anyone who wanted to get through it. But it relied on everyone working together. Being part of a phalanx didn't require a whole lot of skill. These are citizen soldiers, remember, not professionals. You can't expect them to be well trained in complex maneuvers or weapons mastery or anything like that. What mattered in a phalanx far more than skill was strength, guts, and an unbreakable loyalty to your community. The phalanx presented a united wall of metal and muscle that remained strong provided that no gaps formed in it. If a gap did form, if part of the line broke, the entire thing would disintegrate. And when that happened, the very thing that made the Greeks formidable, their heavy armour, their big Corinthian helmets and their massive shields, would then become their greatest weakness. Unable to move quickly or fight anything other than what was directly in front of them, hoplites in a broken phalanx would be slaughtered to a man. In order to make sure a phalanx worked, every man in it had to trust that the man next to him would do his job and not give in to fear. This was the essence of hoplite warfare. It was all about communal trust and working together. Hence the Greek saying that a soldier wears his helmet and his breastplate to protect himself, but he wears his shield to protect his comrades. This is how the Athenians fought. There were no horsemen or archers, not according to Herodotus at least, the army was comprised of heavy infantrymen, fighting in the phalanx and divided up into their tribes, the 10 tribes of Attica, which we discussed in chapter 1. Each one of these 10 tribes, when at war, would elect a leader, a man called the strategos, or the general. So there were 10 strategoi, or generals, who shared command of the Athenian army, and were overseen by a sort of commander-in-chief type figure called the polemikos, or the war archon. In our story, the Athenian polemikos, the commander-in-chief, was a guy called Callimachus. Callimachus marched the Athenian army and its Plataean allies out of Athens and to the plain at Marathon, where they watched as the Persians disembarked. But upon seeing the sheer size of the Persian army, Callimachus and the Athenians are struck with indecision. Do they fight or do they avoid battle and wait for more favourable conditions? Callimachus defers to the opinions of his strategoi, the 10 generals, but they can't agree either. Half of them want one strategy and the other half want another. One thing that Herodotus doesn't really make clear at this point is how much authority Callimachus himself actually had. Was he the complete commander-in-chief, the guy with the last word on everything, or did he merely serve at the pleasure of his generals? Herodotus doesn't really clarify. We know that later, a few generations down the line in Athenian history, the polemikos, the war archon, had become a more ceremonial position, and it was the strategoi, the 10 generals, who actually made the decisions. But it's unclear if this was the case in 490 BCE. The 10 strategoi begin competing to win Callimachus over to their plan. A good many of them want to avoid battle. They can see that they're badly outnumbered and will probably lose. Far better to withdraw, to wait for the Spartans and attack only when they feel they have the advantage. But the other half of the generals of the strategoi advocated for battle immediately. They said this was the decisive moment, we have to fight now. And luckily for this faction, one of them was none other than Miltiades the Phileid. Remember him? Well, yeah, Miltiades was part of the Athenian army. He had already lost a good deal to the Persians. He had lost his little tyranny in the Chersonese. He had lost his eldest son. And he had lost a good deal of his own dignity to them, to be honest with you. And he was done running now. Miltiades had returned to Athens and been prosecuted for his tyranny, which was fair. He was very guilty of being a tyrant. But he had won his court case and gotten himself elected to the generalship of one of the 10 tribes. Now he was commanding 1/10 of the Athenian army, and he insisted that they should fight the Persians. Miltiades appealed to Callimachus personally, and he manipulated the war archon's desire for glory, telling him that if he won a battle here, he would be of immortal reputation. He'd be remembered for all of history. He also reminded Callimachus of the precariousness of their situation, telling the war archon that the choice he made now was the most important in Athenian history. Their city lay at a crossroads. In one direction was defeat, Persian wrath, and the horrors of Hippias coming to power again. Remember that Hippias's reign of terror was still very much within living memory. But down the other road lay victory. Athens would be the first and the only Greek city in history to have withstood the power of Persia. They would defeat the invader and become the leading city amongst all of the Greeks, even more so than the Spartans. Battle would be a high-risk and high-reward strategy, but if they decided to turn and run now, the Athenians might as well just put themselves in chains and hand themselves over to the Persians. Callimachus was won over, and Miltiades was trusted with formulating a strategy for the coming battle. The Athenian army arrayed itself according to Miltiades' instructions. Callimachus, as the polemikos, the war archon, the senior officer there, would command the right flank, which was the place of honour in Greek battles. The Plataeans, the 1,000 allies that had come to Athens' aid, would take the left flank, and the rest of the Athenians, divided by tribe, would fight in the centre. The Persians, who outnumbered the Greeks, presented a far wider line of battle, and Miltiades had to stretch out the Athenian phalanx to match the Persian line and avoid being outflanked. But he didn't stretch the Athenian line out evenly. He decided to weaken the Athenian centre, but keep his flanks at full strength. And then the Athenians advanced. At a run, they ran at the Persians, which is significant. Herodotus notes that this is the first time in history that a Greek army had run into battle, which is hardly surprising. As we've just been over, the average Greek soldier was a hoplite. He was heavily armoured and carried a big, cumbersome shield. And on top of that, he fought in a phalanx, a densely packed formation. If you ever fancy trying it, try running a kilometre in full heavy armour carrying a shield with a bunch of dudes closely packed on either side of you. If you don't end up tripping over the guy in front of you or bashing into the guys at either side, you're still going to be exhausted at the end of the run, and that's when you'd be expected to fight a battle. Nevertheless, Herodotus tells us that the Athenians ran a distance of 8 stades, which is approximately 1.5 kilometers, to get to the Persians. The Persian army, which was equipped primarily with bows and arrows, watched in disbelief as their archers had very little effect on the rapidly advancing Greeks, their arrows largely bouncing off of Greek armour and Greek shields. Herodotus tells us that the Persians believed these Greeks must be madmen, because they could see how few they were in number, and that they had no archers and no cavalry in support. But if the Greeks were indeed madmen, they were madmen who would very soon be on top of the Persians. Now, I've got no idea what being charged by 10,000 heavily armoured Greeks looks like, or sounds like for that matter, and neither do any of you, because no one has experienced anything like this in about 2,000 years. So it's a real shame that Herodotus doesn't really give us too much detail. But a later Greek writer called Xenophon does. Xenophon wrote the Anabasis, and he wrote it about 100 years after the Battle of Marathon, in the early 4th century BCE, and in it he describes a mock battle fought between 10,000 Greek hoplites and the Persian army. And he says that as the Greeks advanced, they would sing hymns all in time, and then, when they were a certain distance from the enemy, they would let out a great cry in unison, screaming "Eleleu!" and then they would bang their spears against their shields rhythmically to scare both men and horses alike. Xenophon says that the sight and sound of this happening was so horrific to behold that the enemy broke before a blow had even been struck. At Marathon, however, the Persians stood their ground. They met the Greek charge, and a ferocious slog ensued. In contrast to the Greek hoplite, with his helmet and his heavy shield and his spear and his breastplate, the Persians were, relatively speaking, ill-equipped for this kind of close-quarters fighting. Again, Herodotus doesn't give us that much detail or description when it comes to how the Persian army fought, but we do have artwork and other sources we can draw from to try and get an idea. It seems that the main strength of the Persian army lay in its archers and in its cavalry. Now, the archers had already proven fairly ineffective at Marathon because of the heavy armour of the Greeks and the fact that they had closed distance with the Persians so rapidly. This is sometimes used as an explanation for why the Athenians ran at Marathon. They wanted to spend as little time as possible in that deadly no man's land where they were in range of Persian missiles. And the Persian cavalry, that lethal wing of the Persian army, that most feared part of the great king's force, so dangerous that Herodotus tells us the Persians specifically chose to land at Marathon so that the flat ground there would give their horsemen an advantage. Well, that Persian cavalry was nowhere to be seen. The Persian cavalry don't seem to have played any role whatsoever at the Battle of Marathon, and Herodotus neglects to mention why this might be. I've heard numerous explanations, ranging from, oh, they were away on some other mission, to, oh, the Persians hadn't properly disembarked their horses from the transports yet. Possibly, all of these explanations are possible, but none of them are confirmable. All we can say for sure is that the Persian cavalry never seemed to show up. So when the Greeks charged the Persian line, they were met by Persian infantry, who, all in all, don't seem to have been as well equipped for close quarters fighting as the Greeks were. I mean, sure, these axes look pretty fierce, and I'm sure they could do a lot of damage with them, but you might also note on these bits of artwork here the complete lack of helmets or breastplates or greaves and things like that. You might also note that Persian shields, unlike their Greek counterparts, which were big, round wooden things coated in bronze, are much, much smaller and made of materials like wicker wood. They were lighter and more maneuverable than their Greek counterparts, but also weaker. Once the battle at Marathon was joined, the fighting seems to have favoured the Greek style of doing things. The light armour and the pinpoint accuracy of Persian archers meant nothing in the compact, close quarters fighting that the Greeks were so good at. But despite this, the weakened Greek centre eventually began to give way. But the Athenian flanks, with Callimachus on the right and the Plataeans on the left, held strong, and eventually the Persian flanks broke and ran. But the Greeks, maintaining discipline, did not pursue them. Instead, they wheeled around and attacked the sides and the rear of the Persian centre, which until this point had been handily winning their section of the battle. Finding themselves surrounded on three sides, the Persian centre broke and ran and fled for the safety of their ships. But now the Athenians were on them, and they chased them all the way back to their vessels. As the Persians attempted to flee to safety, the Greeks set fire to the Persian ships. Fires raged as the Persians tried desperately to escape the slaughter that was taking place on the beach. The Greeks set fire to an unknown quantity of Persian ships and managed to capture 7 of them. But despite this, it seems that most of the Persian fleet and most of the army got away. They managed to get out to sea and to safety. Miltiades and the rest of the Athenians, standing victorious on the beach, could see the direction that the Persians were sailing. They were going south. And it was possibly at this moment that a terrifying possibility crossed Miltiades' mind. Sure, lots of Persians were dead, and plenty of ships had been captured or burned, but the majority of the Persian army and the Persian fleet was still intact, and now they were sailing away. The entire Athenian army was here at Marathon, 26 miles from their city. If the Persians decided to sail south and go around Cape Sunion, they might reach Athens before the army got back in time to defend it. A later story, told by Herodotus, says that the Athenian soldiers could also see a light flashing in the distance, 26 miles away from the city of Athens. Someone in the city had raised a polished shield up, a signal of some sorts. But a signal to whom? Nobody in the Athenian army knew about any signal. Who was this person trying to communicate with? Now remember that one of the key Persian tactics when it came to fighting Greeks was to exploit the disunity, even within single Greek communities, by offering bribes and promises. Both the fall of Eretria and the Battle of Lade and eventual fall of Miletus had been easy victories for the Persians, largely because the Greeks had disintegrated before battle was even joined. They had managed to bring fifth columns over to their side. So bearing this in mind, that signal from Athens could only mean one thing. There was a traitor in the city who was telling the Persians that Athens was vulnerable, and now was the time to attack. Plutarch, who wrote over 5 centuries after these events, tells us that the Athenian army sent a runner in advance of them, someone who had already fought in the battle and was in full armour, who is expected to race all the way back to the city with news of the battle. According to legend, he ran into Athens, went straight into the centre and yelled out "Nike," meaning victory, before immediately collapsing and dying of exhaustion. The Roman writer Lucian, who wrote between 6 and 7 centuries after the Battle of Marathon, tells us that this runner was none other than Phidippides, the exact same guy who had already run 150 miles to Sparta and then 150 miles back to ask them for help. And with all of these accounts combined, we get the full origin myth of the Marathon, the 26-mile run, based on the distance from the Battle of Marathon to the city of Athens. It is worth noting that the modern idea of a marathon is just that. It is a modern idea. The first 26-mile marathon was run in 1896 for the first modern Olympics, so the ancient Greeks wouldn't have understood any of this. But that being said, I think it's a very cool little nod to the classical world, that has inspired so many things in the modern one, such as the modern Olympics. In Herodotus' account, however, there is no single runner. Instead, the entire Athenian army bombs it back to Athens, runs the full 26 miles in full armour, having just fought a battle. The Persian fleet, which did round Cape Sunion and was approaching the city of Athens, could see that it was defended, that there were men on the walls, and seeing this, the Persians gave up. They turned around and they sailed home. The Athenians could breathe a sigh of relief, and Miltiades could finally proclaim with full confidence that victory was theirs. Here's another little fun fact for you. Since 1983, the Greeks have hosted an annual ultramarathon called the Spartathlon, which recreates Phidippides' run from Athens to Sparta to ask the Spartans for their help. The athletes start at the foot of the Acropolis, where they begin a 153-mile ultramarathon, which ends at the statue of Leonidas in Sparta. I think that's pretty cool. Speaking of the Spartans, did they ever show up? I know they promised that they would, but did they ever actually, come to Attica and try and help fight the Persians? Well, yes, they did. The Spartans did show up, but too late to do anything useful. The Spartans arrive at Marathon just in time to help the Athenians clear everything up and bury their dead. According to Herodotus, who, bear in mind, can be a little bit unreliable when it comes to numbers in battles, the plain at Marathon stood as a testament to the superiority of Greek arms. 6,400 Persians lay dead on the beach. Contrasting to that, only 192 fallen Greeks. Amongst the 192 dead Greeks was Callimachus, the war archon, who had fallen during the battle. One of the 10 strategoi, the 10 generals, had also been killed, the one who had led the main attack on the Persian ships. He had attempted to grab Persian fugitives as they were fleeing, but as he reached out to grab them, someone had turned around with an axe and hacked his arm off, and he had bled to death in the surf. And the brother of that general who was killed by having his arm chopped off was also present at the battle and was none other than a young playwright called Aeschylus, who would go on to be one of the most important people in the history of Greek theatre. 18 years after the Battle of Marathon, Aeschylus would write a play called The Persians, which is a fascinating read, especially when you consider that Aeschylus had fought the Persians and lost a brother in battle to them. The Spartans helped the Athenians and the Plataeans bury their dead, which also gave them the opportunity, which they were very excited about, to look at some Persians up close. The Spartans then declared their admiration for the Athenians, high praise from the famously laconic and snobbish Spartiates, and then the Spartans went home. The Athenians and the Plataeans buried their dead on the battlefield, as was the custom to honour those that had fallen in war. The grave of the Greek dead was set up with a tombstone, which had on it inscribed a poem by Simonides, which reads, "Fighting at the forefront of the Greeks, the Athenians at Marathon laid low the army of gilded Medes. The Persian Empire had been decisively halted in its attempt to invade Greece. The Athenians had not only resisted the Persians, they had done it on their own, with no help from the Spartans or any other cities other than a small force of volunteers from Plataea. As you can imagine, this filled the city and the young democracy with a sense of intense pride and confidence. They had proven that the Persians could be beaten. Miltiades was obviously a hero. Everybody forgot about his shady past as the tyrant of the Chersonese. And in the weeks following Marathon, there was nobody more popular in Athens than the guy who had planned the winning strategy. But unfortunately for Miltiades, the Greeks as a people generally aren't kind to their own heroes. Miltiades used his newfound power and influence to start going after personal rivals. He convinced the Athenian demos to give him funds to build 70 ships, with which he planned to attack the island of Paros. Now, he told everybody in Athens that this was because the Parians had assisted the Persians during their invasion, but Herodotus tells us that this was untrue. Miltiades just had a personal feud with a prominent man on Paros, and he was looking to settle a score. Miltiades' expedition to Paros was an absolute disaster. He sat outside the city for a full 20 days, and he got nothing to show for it other than a nasty leg wound. The Athenian people were growing anxious about the idea that they might be drawn into a long, protracted conflict, so they turned on Miltiades. They prosecuted him for the crime of deceiving the Athenian people. Miltiades managed to narrowly avoid being given the death penalty, and instead he was slapped with an enormous fine, and he would have to stay in prison until he could pay it. But whilst in prison, Miltiades' leg wound became infected, and the celebrated general died less than a year after fighting the battle that would forever earn him a place in Greek history. Back in Persia, King Darius was absolutely fuming, and more determined than ever to exact revenge on the city of Athens. He sent messages to all of the satraps of his empire, telling them to gather men and provisions, ready for an even larger invasion. But this second invasion never materialized. Darius's empire broke out in open rebellion, especially in Egypt. The Egyptians, who had likely heard about the Battle of Marathon and the Persian defeat there, were likely filled with a sense of confidence. They had never liked Persian rule anyway, and hell, if a small and fairly insignificant Greek city like Athens could resist Persia, surely an ancient and powerful kingdom like Egypt could as well. King Darius spent the last years of his life trying to put these rebellions down, before dying in the year 486 BCE. When he did so, the throne of Persia passed to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes was a very different man to his father. Herodotus' portrayal of him, which is probably inaccurate, is of a far, far weaker king and a weaker man personally, someone who is easily manipulated and bends to the whims of his influential advisors. Xerxes enters the political scene by hosting a great debate about what to do next, whether or not Persia should go to Greece. And it's one of my favourite scenes in all of Herodotus' histories. Xerxes is joined for this great debate by a real who's who of important people from within the Persian Empire. His nobles, his extended family, his satraps and his generals, but also a number of Greek defectors who see Xerxes as their best chance of returning home and gaining power for themselves. The ruling families of Thessaly and other northern Greek states, as well as the Pisistratids, that exiled family of tyrants from Athens, who are still petitioning the Persian king to invade and restore them to power. Hippias, the old tyrant, is dead at this point, by the way. The old man finally expired on the way back from Marathon, but he had plenty of relatives in Persia who still held quite a lot of sway. Xerxes also had at his side the exiled ex-king of Sparta, Demaratus. You guys remember him from chapter 2? I know it was a while ago, it's been a long video, but Demaratus was that Spartan king that had clashed with Cleomenes, and as a result of this, and some confusion regarding who his real father was, Demaratus had been deposed as king of Sparta. He had then gone on a little adventure all around Greece, always being pursued by Spartan agents, before eventually winding up at the court of King Xerxes, where the great king of Persia considered him a powerful and valuable asset. And so the great debate began on whether or not the Persians should launch a second invasion of Greece. The first to step forward was the king's cousin, Mardonius, the great general, who had been stripped of his command and humiliated a few years earlier after his fleet had been sunk by a storm off Mount Athos. Now Mardonius was keen to see his honour restored, and he saw war with Greece as his best opportunity to do this. Mardonius argued that Athens couldn't be allowed to go unpunished. The great king looked weak at the moment. His empire was reeling from rebellions and this embarrassing defeat at Marathon, and he was new to the job. People were still wondering what kind of a king he was going to be. Was he worth fearing and respecting? If Xerxes invaded Greece and destroyed Athens, everyone would know that he was a force to be reckoned with, and equal to his great father, Darius. Besides, Greece is a beautiful and wealthy land that would make a fine addition to the empire. Mardonius really underplays the potential danger of a second invasion, saying that, the Greeks are a weak people, they're not great fighters, they won't put up any dangerous resistance. After all, Persia already rules over so many of them, so how dangerous can they really be? The Greeks, says Mardonius, are a simple, unsophisticated, and unintelligent people who are going to be easy to beat. After all, they fight in a stupid way, so he thinks, in a phalanx, all infantry, no cavalry or archers, and they require flat ground to do this properly. He says all the Persians have to do is find some uneven ground, and the Greeks won't be able to deploy, and they'll be able to run circles round them. Easy as can be. Besides, it probably won't even come to that. The Greeks will probably surrender as soon as we appear, because fighting would be a stupid thing to do. Then again, ponders Mardonius, the Greeks are stupid, so maybe they will try and fight, but they'll be easy to beat. Xerxes is fully convinced by this, and he makes a long speech of his own, in which he emphasizes the importance of avenging the sack of Sardis and the defeat at Marathon. He also reminds his nobles that the Persians are a warlike people who thrive on battle and shouldn't shy away from it. It seems that all has been decided, but then another Persian nobleman steps forward. He was the king's own uncle, the brother and main advisor to the last king, Darius, and a veteran of numerous battles. His name was Artabanus, and he made this argument. Artabanus begins his argument by pontificating on the importance of debate, saying that even if an answer to something seems obvious, it's always worth hearing the alternative points of view. He then openly disagrees with Mardonius's slander of the Greeks, that they're a stupid and unintelligent people that pose no threat to Persia. He reminds everyone that this stupid and unintelligent people had recently destroyed a Persian army at Marathon. No, the Persians cannot go to Greece under the impression that these people aren't a threat. To do that is to underestimate them, and to underestimate them will mean death. He then turns to King Xerxes and warns him that Greece is far away. If the great king goes there and finds himself cut off, he would be in serious danger. I mean, looking at things from the outside, I know it seems like this is going to be a walk in the park. The Persians are powerful and richer and by every metric greater than the Greeks. Even if all the Greeks were united, that would be the case. And the Greeks are very much not united. But the Persians shouldn't let that lull them into this false sense of security. Xerxes, he says, should meditate on the fact that lightning strikes the tallest trees, not the smallest ones. Artabanus then turns to Mardonius, and he admonishes him for this cavalier attitude. He accuses him, correctly according to Herodotus, of being motivated purely by his personal desire for glory. And then he issues Mardonius a challenge. He tells Mardonius that he ought to put his own family's life on the line. He makes a bet with him. He says if the war goes badly, if the expedition fails or the king is endangered, Mardonius should offer up his own children to be executed. Artabanus will do the same. If the campaign goes off without a hitch, like Mardonius says, he will kill his own children. When he sees the look of shock on Mardonius's face, he points at him and says, "If you are not so confident of victory that you wouldn't gamble your own children's life on it, then you should not be gambling our king's life on it either." He then threatens Mardonius with a prophecy. He predicts that at some point in the future, the Persian court will receive news of Mardonius's death, and that he has been eaten by dogs in either Athens or Sparta. Xerxes is furious at this. He turns in a rage at Artabanus and accuses him of being a coward. He tells him that if anyone else had spoken to him this way, he would punish him severely for it. But seeing as Artabanus was Xerxes' father's brother, his own uncle, he would spare him the death penalty. Instead, as punishment for this cowardice, for this slander against Mardonius and himself, Artabanus would be forbidden from joining the invasion of Greece. Instead, he would have to sit in shame back in Persia with the women and the children. But later that evening, as Xerxes was getting ready for bed, he thought on his uncle's words, and he saw the wisdom in them. He decided that the next day he would apologize, and he would reverse his plans to invade Greece. And so Xerxes tucked himself into bed and drifted off into a peaceful, kingly sleep. But later that night, Xerxes was seized by terrible dreams. He saw a man standing over him, paralyzing him, and in a booming speech this man said, "Persian, are you changing your mind?" Not knowing what to do, Xerxes woke and went to his uncle and told him all about the dream. He apologized for how he acted the day before and said that he really wants to call off the invasion of Greece, but he's also worried that this dream might be a message from the gods. He doesn't know what to do. Artabanus, who very much embodied the archetype of a perfect advisor and slightly fatherly figure, told Xerxes not to worry about apologizing. He wasn't upset at being rebuked. He was only upset that his nephew, who he knew had a good heart, was surrounded by bad advisors. He also told Xerxes not to get too wound up by this dream. Dreams in the night are reflections of anxieties in the day, and that is the more likely explanation than all of this being supernatural. Xerxes is comforted by this, but he wanted to be sure. He told Artabanus that night he wanted him to sleep in his bed and wear the royal pajamas. That way maybe they could trick this god or ghost or whatever it was into entering his uncle's dreams instead. Artabanus pointed out that this was not only a little bit weird, but also unlikely to work. If the dream was indeed sent by a god, surely that god is not going to be tricked by a simple change of clothes. But okay, fine, he'll do it. That night, Artabanus, wearing the king's clothes and sleeping in the king's bed, saw the spectre appear before him in his dreams. "So you're the one who has discouraged Xerxes from attacking Greece." Then the figure closed in to poke out Artabanus's eyes. Artabanus told Xerxes about his dream, and the great king knew what he had to do now. He sent word to all four corners of his empire. Ships would need to be built, rope would need to be made, weapons would need to be forged, and soldiers would need to be trained. Across the western part of the Persian Empire, huge supply depots were constructed, enough to feed an enormous host. For 4 years, Xerxes gathered an enormous army, so large that it drank rivers dry as it moved slowly and inevitably westwards. Back in Greece, the success at Marathon had lulled the Athenians and many other Greeks into a false sense of security. Many people thought that a second Persian invasion was impossible, it would never happen. But there were those who had the foresight to see that it was inevitable. One such man was a young, up-and-coming Athenian politician called Themistocles. Themistocles had fought at Marathon, and he'd learned a thing or two about the Persians. He knew that if the Athenians were to survive a second Persian invasion, they would need to prepare themselves. They would have to be ready to resist Persia not only on land, but also at sea. But all of that is for the next video. Thank you everybody for watching.